Before Columbus set foot on American shores, before the first European maps were drawn of this continent, civilizations were rising and falling across the Americas that would make the Roman Empire look modest in comparison. Tonight, we're diving into the hidden chapters of ancient American history that have been buried, forgotten, and sometimes deliberately obscured for centuries. You've probably never heard of Cahokia, a city that once housed more people than London in the 12th century. You might not know that ancient Americans built pyramids that rival those in Egypt, or that they created trade networks spanning thousands of miles. And you almost certainly haven't been told about the massive human sacrifices, the sophisticated astronomical observatories, or the engineering marvels that predate European contact by 1,000 years. So grab something warm to drink, dim the lights, and settle in for a journey through the real ancient America. Because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about this continent's past. The story begins not with wooden ships crossing the Atlantic, but with footprints pressed into mud 23,000 years ago. In 2021, archaeologists working at White Sands National Park in New Mexico made a discovery that shattered our understanding of when humans first arrived in the Americas. These weren't just any footprints. They were the tracks of adults and children, preserved in layers of sediment and dated using seeds embedded in the same deposits. 23,000 years ago. That's more than 10,000 years earlier than we previously thought humans reached the Americas. These people were walking across what is now New Mexico, while ice sheets still covered much of North America. They were hunting giant ground sloths and mammoths, raising families, and establishing communities while Europe was still locked in the depths of the last ice age. But here's what makes this discovery even more remarkable. The footprints show evidence of sophisticated tracking and hunting techniques. Children's prints weave between adult tracks, suggesting organized group movement. Some tracks show people carrying heavy loads. Others reveal playful interactions between family members. This wasn't a handful of desperate refugees stumbling across a land bridge. These were established communities with complex social structures. The implications are staggering. If humans were thriving in the Americas 23,000 years ago, then everything we've been taught about the peopling of the New World needs to be rewritten. The traditional narrative of small bands crossing Beringia and slowly spreading south becomes just one chapter in a much longer, more complex story. Yet for decades, archaeologists who suggested earlier dates for human arrival faced ridicule from their colleagues. Sites with evidence of pre-Clovis occupation were dismissed, careers were damaged, and funding was denied. The academic establishment had decided that humans arrived 13,000 years ago, and any evidence to the contrary was treated as contamination or misinterpretation. This pattern of suppression isn't unique to the White Sands discovery. Throughout American archaeology, findings that challenge established narratives have been marginalized, buried in obscure journals, or simply ignored. The reasons are complex, involving academic politics, cultural bias, and sometimes deliberate attempts to minimize the sophistication of pre-Columbian civilizations. Consider the Meadowcroft rock shelter in Pennsylvania, where archaeologist James Adavasio uncovered evidence of human occupation dating back 19,000 years. For 40 years, his findings were dismissed by mainstream archaeology. Colleagues accused him of contamination, questioned his methods, and excluded his work from major conferences. Only recently have other sites begun to confirm what Adavasio had been arguing all along. The resistance to these discoveries reflects a deeper problem in how we understand ancient America. For too long, the narrative has been shaped by the assumption that complex civilization was imported by Europeans. Indigenous peoples were portrayed as simple hunter-gatherers living in harmony with nature, lacking the sophistication to build great cities or develop advanced technologies. This romanticized but ultimately demeaning view served colonial purposes perfectly. If Native Americans were primitive and uncivilized, then European conquest could be justified as bringing progress to a backward continent. The reality, as we're about to see, was far different. By the time Europeans arrived, the Americas were home to some of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. Cities with populations in the tens of thousands, astronomical observatories more accurate than anything in Europe, agricultural systems that fed millions, and trade networks that spanned continents. These weren't savage wildernesses waiting for civilization. They were advanced societies with their own complex histories of rise, decline, conquest, and cultural exchange. But acknowledging this sophistication raised uncomfortable questions for colonial powers. How could they justify seizing land from people who had built great cities and governed complex states? How could they claim to be bringing civilization to a continent that already had universities, libraries, and mathematical systems more advanced than their own? The solution was systematic erasure. Indigenous achievements were downplayed, their cities described as villages, their sophisticated governments dismissed as primitive chiefdoms. Archaeological evidence was reinterpreted through European frameworks that emphasized what Native Americans lacked rather than what they had accomplished. This process continued well into the 20th century. Textbooks taught children that Native Americans had no written language, ignoring the complex glyphic systems of the Maya and the Quipu record-keeping of the Inca. They claimed that indigenous peoples had no understanding of metallurgy, despite evidence of sophisticated copper, gold, and bronze working throughout the Americas. They insisted that Native Americans lived in small, scattered bands, while archaeological evidence revealed massive urban centers with populations that dwarfed contemporary European cities. Perhaps nowhere is this distortion more evident than in our understanding of Cahokia, the great metropolis that once dominated the Mississippi River Valley. At its peak, around 1100 CE, Cahokia was home to perhaps 20,000 people, making it larger than London, Paris, or Rome at the same time. Its influence extended across much of eastern North America, with satellite communities and trading partners from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The city was built around Monk's Mound, a massive earthen pyramid that remains the largest prehistoric structure north of Mexico. Rising 100 feet above the surrounding floodplain, the mound required the movement of more than 22 million cubic feet of earth, all carried in baskets by human labor. The precision of its construction rivals that of any pyramid in Egypt or Mexico. But Monk's Mound was just one of more than 120 mounds that dotted the Cahokian landscape. Some were burial mounds for the elite, others were platforms for temples and residences. Together, they formed a carefully planned urban complex that reflected sophisticated understanding of engineering, astronomy, and urban planning. The city was laid out according to precise astronomical alignments. The Grand Plaza, a 50-acre open space at the heart of the settlement, was oriented to the cardinal directions with an accuracy that modern surveyors would envy. Wooden posts called wood henges marked the positions of the sun and moon at key points in their cycles, allowing Cahokian priests to predict eclipses and track the passage of seasons with remarkable precision. This wasn't primitive sky watching. It was advanced astronomy that required generations of careful observation and mathematical calculation. The Cahokians understood concepts like the precession of the equinoxes and could predict celestial events decades in advance. Their calendar was more accurate than the Julian calendar used by Europeans at the same time. Yet for most of American history, Cahokia was either unknown or dismissed as the work of a lost race of white people who had somehow vanished before Europeans arrived. This mound builder myth persisted well into the 20th century, despite overwhelming evidence that the mounds were built by the ancestors of contemporary Native American tribes. The myth served obvious purposes. If the great earthworks of the Midwest and Southeast were built by vanished white people rather than living Native Americans, then conquest of indigenous lands could be justified as simply reclaiming territory that had once belonged to a superior race. The real builders, according to this narrative, had been wiped out by savage Indians who were incapable of such achievements. This racist interpretation was finally debunked by serious archaeology, but not before it had shaped popular understanding for generations. Even today, many Americans are unaware that their ancestors built some of the most impressive monuments in the ancient world. The scale of these achievements becomes clear when we examine other major sites across ancient America. At Poverty Point in Louisiana, people were building massive earthworks as early as 1700 BCE, more than 1,000 years before the founding of Rome. The site consists of concentric ridges arranged in a perfect octagon, with each ridge standing up to 6 feet high and extending for miles across the landscape. The precision of Poverty Point's construction suggests a level of mathematical sophistication that archaeologists are only beginning to appreciate. The ridges are spaced at exact intervals, the angles are geometrically perfect, and the entire complex appears to have been laid out according to a master plan that would have required advanced surveying techniques. Recent analysis has revealed that Poverty Point was more than just an impressive earthwork. It was the center of a vast trade network that brought exotic materials from across North America. Copper from the Great Lakes, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, and shells from the Gulf Coast all flowed through this ancient hub of commerce. The people who built Poverty Point weren't isolated hunter-gatherers scraping out a subsistence living. They were sophisticated traders and engineers who understood complex logistics and could organize massive construction projects requiring thousands of workers. They had developed standardized weights and measures, quality control systems for trade goods, and administrative structures capable of managing far-flung commercial networks. Similar patterns emerge at sites across the Americas. At Spiro Mounds in Oklahoma, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a trading empire that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico and from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains. The elite burials at Spiro contained artifacts made from materials that could only have come from thousands of miles away, evidence of commercial relationships that spanned the continent. These weren't simple exchanges between neighboring tribes. They were sophisticated trade networks with standardized currencies, quality controls, and complex credit systems. Merchants could travel thousands of miles knowing that their goods would be accepted and fairly valued by partners they had never met. The scale and sophistication of these networks rivaled anything in the medieval world. Yet this evidence of ancient American sophistication has been systematically ignored or downplayed in popular histories. The narrative of primitive peoples living in isolated bands has proven remarkably persistent, despite mounting archaeological evidence to the contrary. Part of this persistence reflects genuine academic conservatism. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and archaeologists are rightly cautious about overinterpreting their findings. But part of it also reflects deeper cultural biases about what indigenous peoples were capable of achieving. These biases become particularly evident when we examine the response to evidence of ancient writing systems in the Americas. For decades, archaeologists insisted that Native Americans had no true writing, only crude pictographs and memory aids. This claim persisted even as Maya glyphs were being deciphered and Inca quipus were being recognized as sophisticated recording systems. The reluctance to acknowledge indigenous writing systems wasn't based on lack of evidence. Maya texts had been known since the Spanish conquest, and their mathematical and astronomical content clearly demonstrated advanced literacy. Inca quipus recorded detailed information about everything from census data to historical events, using a complex system of knots and colors that functioned as effectively as any alphabetic script. Instead, the reluctance reflected assumptions about what counted as real writing. European-style alphabetic scripts were considered the gold standard, while other systems were dismissed as primitive or transitional. This ethnocentric bias prevented recognition of the remarkable diversity and sophistication of indigenous recording systems. The consequences of this bias extend far beyond academic archaeology. When indigenous peoples are portrayed as pre-literate, it becomes easier to dismiss their claims to sophisticated governmental, legal, and intellectual traditions. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, for example, operated under a complex constitution that influenced the development of American democracy. But this achievement is often minimized because their laws were preserved orally rather than in writing. Similar patterns of historical suppression emerge when we examine the evidence for transoceanic contact between the Americas and the Old World long before Columbus. Along the coasts of California, mysterious stone walls snake through the Berkeley Hills, their origins lost to time. The Spanish found them already ancient when they arrived, and local Ohlone people reported they had always been there. These aren't defensive fortifications. They're too low, too fragmented, and in places they form decorative spirals that serve no military purpose. The Berkeley Mystery Walls present a puzzle that mainstream archaeology has struggled to address. Radiocarbon dating suggests portions have been buried for centuries, possibly millennia. Yet their construction techniques don't match known indigenous building traditions from the region. Some sections show evidence of sophisticated stone cutting and fitting that required advanced tools and mathematical precision. Even more intriguing are the Dighton rock carvings discovered in Massachusetts in 1680. This partially submerged boulder bears inscriptions that have defied definitive interpretation for over 3 centuries. The symbols include what appear to be ships, human figures, and complex geometric patterns. While most scholars attribute them to local indigenous peoples documenting encounters with early explorers, the style and content remain anomalous. The carvings show techniques and artistic conventions that don't appear in other known Native American petroglyphs from the region. Some symbols bear striking resemblances to Phoenician, Norse, or even Asian writing systems. This doesn't prove ancient contact, but it raises questions about cultural exchanges that standard historical narratives don't address. Out in the deserts of California and Arizona, the Blythe intaglios present another enigma. These massive ground drawings, some stretching over 170 feet in length, were created by removing dark surface stones to reveal lighter soil beneath. Like Peru's Nazca lines, they're virtually invisible from ground level, but form clear images when viewed from above. The intaglios depict human figures, animals, and geometric shapes arranged across miles of desert landscape. They were only discovered in the 1930s when a pilot happened to fly overhead and spot them. Dating suggests they were created between 400 and 2,000 years ago, long before any known aircraft existed to view them from above. The question that haunts archaeologists is simple. Why would ancient peoples invest enormous effort creating images that could only be properly seen from a perspective they couldn't achieve? The traditional explanation suggests they were meant for spiritual purposes, perhaps as pathways for souls traveling to the afterlife. But this raises deeper questions about ancient American understanding of geography, scale, and spatial relationships. These mysteries pale in comparison to what archaeologists have uncovered about the true nature of ancient American warfare and ritual violence. For decades, popular narratives portrayed pre-Columbian peoples as living in peaceful harmony with nature, engaged only in minor skirmishes over resources. The reality was far more complex and often brutally violent. At Cahokia, the evidence for systematic human sacrifice is overwhelming. Mound 72, located south of the Great Central Pyramid, contained the remains of over 250 individuals, most of them young women who had been killed and carefully arranged in mass graves. The burials weren't random or hastily executed. They followed precise ritual patterns that suggest elaborate ceremonies involving hundreds of participants. The central burial in Mound 72 tells an even more disturbing story. A high-status male was interred on a bed of 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a thunderbird. Surrounding him were the bodies of 4 men whose heads and hands had been cut off and positioned nearby. These weren't battle casualties or victims of disease. They were deliberate sacrifices performed to accompany a powerful leader into the afterlife. Carbon dating places these mass killings at the height of Cahokia's power, around 1050 to 1100 CE. This wasn't a civilization in decline resorting to desperate measures. It was a thriving metropolis at the peak of its influence, conducting elaborate rituals that required the systematic execution of hundreds of people. The scale suggests state-sponsored violence carried out by a highly organized religious and political elite. The victims weren't enemies captured in battle, but likely members of Cahokian society itself, possibly selected for sacrifice based on age, gender, or social status. The careful arrangement of bodies and grave goods indicates these killings were performed according to established protocols that had been refined over generations. Similar evidence emerges from sites across ancient America. At Pueblo Bonito, in New Mexico's Chaco Canyon, archaeologists have uncovered burials that show clear evidence of violent death and ritual mutilation. Cut marks on bones, decapitated skulls, and dismembered remains suggest practices that went far beyond simple warfare or punishment. The ancestral Puebloan peoples, formerly known as the Anasazi, have left particularly disturbing evidence of systematic violence. At the Cowboy Wash site in southwestern Colorado, researchers discovered the remains of 12 individuals who had been systematically dismembered, defleshed, and in some cases cooked. The bone modifications are identical to those found on animal remains from the same site, suggesting these people were processed for consumption. The evidence for cannibalism among the ancestral Puebloans extends far beyond a single site. Physical anthropologist Christy Turner documented similar bone modifications at over 40 locations across the Four Corners region. The patterns are consistent: systematic dismemberment, removal of flesh, and breaking of long bones to extract marrow. In some cases, the bones show evidence of being boiled or roasted. In 2000, biochemical analysis provided definitive proof. Researchers examining fossilized human feces from the Cowboy Wash site found traces of human myoglobin, a protein found only in human muscle tissue. This wasn't accidental contamination or ritual handling of the dead. People were consuming human flesh as food. The context of this cannibalism reveals something even more disturbing about ancient American society. The violence occurred during a period of severe drought and social upheaval, but it wasn't random or desperate. The systematic nature of the processing, the careful selection of victims, and the ritualized aspects of the killings suggest this was sanctioned behavior carried out according to established cultural protocols. Recent discoveries have revealed an even darker pattern. At Sacred Ridge in Colorado, archaeologists uncovered the remains of 35 individuals who had been systematically tortured, killed, and mutilated around 800 CE. The evidence includes two-headed axes stained with human blood, skull fragments showing evidence of scalping, and bones that had been deliberately broken while the victims were still alive. The violence at Sacred Ridge wasn't warfare between competing groups. Genetic analysis suggests the victims were members of the local community, possibly an entire extended family that had been targeted for elimination. The systematic nature of the killings, combined with the ritual destruction of their remains, suggests this was sanctioned genocide carried out by their own neighbors. These discoveries challenge fundamental assumptions about ancient American society. The traditional narrative of peaceful peoples living in harmony with nature gives way to a more complex picture of sophisticated civilizations capable of both remarkable achievements and systematic brutality. The same cultures that built magnificent cities and developed advanced astronomical knowledge also practiced human sacrifice on a massive scale. The evidence from Mesoamerica reveals violence on an even grander scale. When Spanish conquistadors first entered Tenochtitlan, they reported seeing massive skull racks containing tens of thousands of human heads. For centuries, these accounts were dismissed as exaggerations meant to justify Spanish conquest. Archaeological excavations at the Templo Mayor have confirmed that the Spanish weren't exaggerating. The Huaytzompantli, the Great Skull Rack of Tenochtitlan, contained at least 600 human skulls when archaeologists began excavating it in 2015. Carbon dating and osteological analysis reveal these weren't ancient remains or battle trophies. They were fresh sacrifices, regularly replenished as older skulls decomposed or were removed. The skulls belonged to men, women, and children from across Mesoamerica. Isotope analysis of tooth enamel shows many victims had lived in Tenochtitlan for months or years before being sacrificed, suggesting they were integrated into Aztec society before being selected for ritual death. This wasn't random violence against enemies, but systematic sacrifice of community members, according to religious calendars. The scale of Aztec sacrifice becomes clear when we examine specific ceremonies. During the dedication of the expanded Templo Mayor in 1487, Spanish sources report that over 80,000 captives were sacrificed over 4 days. While this number may be inflated, archaeological evidence suggests sacrifices did occur on massive scales during major religious festivals. The methods of sacrifice were deliberately theatrical and designed to maximize both physical suffering and psychological impact on witnesses. Victims were flayed alive, drowned, shot with arrows, or had their hearts cut out while conscious. Children were sacrificed to Tlaloc, the rain god, with priests believing their tears would bring precipitation. The more the children suffered, the more pleased the god would be. These practices weren't aberrations or signs of cultural decay. They were central features of Aztec religion and statecraft, performed according to precise ritual calendars by trained priests in elaborate ceremonies, attended by thousands of spectators. The sacrifices were recorded in detailed codices that tracked the number of victims, the methods of killing, and the religious significance of each death. The political functions of mass sacrifice were as important as the religious ones. Public executions demonstrated state power and served as warnings to potential rebels or enemy populations. The ability to command hundreds of human lives for ritual purposes proved the absolute authority of rulers and priests. Cities that could dedicate more victims in their ceremonies gained prestige and political influence throughout Mesoamerica. Recent excavations continue to reveal the staggering scope of ritual violence in ancient America. At the Mayan site of Chichen Itza, the sacred cenote has yielded hundreds of human remains spanning centuries of sacrifice. Men, women, and children were thrown into the natural sinkhole as offerings to the rain god Chak, often weighed down with jade ornaments and gold jewelry to ensure they sank to the bottom. The victims at Chichen Itza weren't just local people. Isotope analysis reveals they came from across the Maya world, suggesting systematic networks for acquiring sacrificial victims. Some show evidence of being held in captivity for extended periods before their deaths, possibly fattened or prepared according to specific ritual requirements. At other Maya sites, ball courts served as venues for human sacrifice on a massive scale. The famous reliefs at El Tajin show players being decapitated after games, their blood feeding the earth and ensuring agricultural fertility. Recent excavations beneath these courts have uncovered mass graves containing hundreds of individuals, many showing evidence of ritual decapitation. The sophistication of these killing grounds rivals anything found in the Roman Colosseum. Stone channels directed blood flow away from sacrifice platforms. Specially designed altars allowed priests to efficiently remove hearts from living victims. Acoustic properties were carefully engineered so that screams and chants would carry to spectators seated hundreds of feet away. This evidence of systematic ritual violence has been systematically downplayed or ignored in popular accounts of ancient American civilizations. Museums display beautiful Maya art and impressive Aztec architecture, while glossing over the mass graves and blood-stained altars that are equally authentic parts of these cultures. School textbooks mention human sacrifice in passing, but rarely convey the industrial scale on which it was practiced. The reasons for this sanitization are complex. Partly, it reflects legitimate concerns about reinforcing racist stereotypes that portray indigenous peoples as savage or primitive. Partly it stems from romantic notions about ancient wisdom and harmony with nature that don't accommodate evidence of systematic brutality, and partly it results from political pressures to present Native American history in ways that support contemporary cultural and legal claims. But ignoring the evidence of ritual violence does a disservice to the complexity and humanity of ancient American peoples. These weren't cartoon savages or noble primitives. They were sophisticated human beings who created remarkable civilizations, while also engaging in practices that we find morally abhorrent. Understanding this complexity is essential to grasping the full scope of what was lost when European diseases and conquest devastated the Americas. The collapse of these civilizations represents one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history, but it didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't simply the result of European military superiority. Many of the great ancient American cities were already abandoned when Europeans arrived, their populations scattered by internal conflicts, environmental pressures, and social upheavals that we're only beginning to understand. The abandonment of Cahokia around 1350 CE remains one of archaeology's most haunting puzzles. At its peak, this was a metropolis that commanded tribute from settlements across half a continent. Its traders carried exotic goods from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean. Its astronomers tracked celestial cycles with precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. And then, within a few generations, it was gone. The collapse wasn't sudden. Archaeological evidence shows a gradual decline that began around 1200 CE and accelerated through the 13th and 14th centuries. Population dropped from 20,000 to just a few hundred. The great plazas fell silent. Weeds grew through the carefully maintained ceremonial centers. By the time French explorers reached the Mississippi Valley in the 17th century, Cahokia was already a ghost town, its massive mounds serving as mysterious reminders of a forgotten civilization. What happened? The evidence points to a perfect storm of environmental catastrophe, social upheaval, and political collapse that offers disturbing parallels to modern concerns about sustainability and social inequality. Tree ring data reveals that the Mississippi Valley experienced severe droughts between 1100 and 1250 CE, just as Cahokia reached its maximum population. The carefully managed floodplain agriculture that had supported the city's growth began to fail. Crop yields declined. Tributary communities that had supplied food and labor started keeping their resources for themselves. At the same time, Cahokia's elite were demanding ever more elaborate displays of wealth and power. The construction of massive ceremonial complexes accelerated even as agricultural production declined. More people were required for building projects and ritual activities, removing them from food production, just when every worker was needed in the fields. The social tensions created by this combination of environmental stress and elite excess are visible in the archaeological record. Around 1175 CE, the Cahokians began constructing massive wooden palisades around the central ceremonial district. These weren't defenses against outside enemies, but barriers protecting the elite quarter from their own people. The palisades were built and rebuilt multiple times, suggesting ongoing internal conflict. Burned buildings, scattered human remains, and caches of weapons indicate that civil violence became increasingly common. The carefully ordered society that had built the great mounds was fragmenting into competing factions. But the most disturbing evidence comes from the ritual sites themselves. As Cahokian society collapsed, human sacrifice intensified rather than diminished. Mass graves from this period show evidence of increasingly desperate attempts to appease supernatural forces through the systematic killing of community members. At Mound 72, archaeologists have identified multiple phases of sacrifice spanning the city's decline. The later burials show signs of starvation and disease among the victims, suggesting that even the human resources devoted to ritual killing were becoming scarce. The elaborate ceremonies that had once demonstrated Cahokian power became frantic attempts to restore divine favor through ever greater bloodshed. The failure of these rituals to restore prosperity likely contributed to the final collapse of elite authority. When the gods failed to answer, despite hundreds of sacrificial deaths, people lost faith in the system that had dominated their lives for generations. The survivors scattered to smaller communities throughout the Mississippi Valley, carrying with them memories of the great city but abandoning its centralized political structure forever. Cahokia's collapse wasn't unique. Across ancient America, we find evidence of similar cycles of growth, environmental stress, social inequality, and eventual abandonment. The pattern is so consistent that archaeologists have begun to identify warning signs that predict when complex societies are approaching catastrophic failure. In the Southwest, the great houses of Chaco Canyon tell a parallel story of unsustainable growth and dramatic collapse. Between 850 and 1150 CE, the ancestral Puebloan peoples constructed massive stone buildings that required millions of timber beams carried from forests hundreds of miles away. These weren't practical residences, but monumental architecture designed to demonstrate the power and wealth of Chacoan elites. Recent analysis of tree rings from these buildings reveals the environmental cost of Chacoan construction projects. Entire forest ecosystems were clear-cut to provide timber for the great houses. The deforestation was so complete that it altered local climate patterns, reducing rainfall and increasing erosion throughout the region. As the forests disappeared, the Chacans had to travel ever greater distances for construction materials. Roads extending hundreds of miles connected outlying communities to the canyon, along which workers hauled massive logs and stone blocks for increasingly elaborate building projects. The labor requirements were staggering, likely involving thousands of people working seasonally on construction while trying to maintain agricultural communities scattered across the harsh desert landscape. The system worked as long as environmental conditions remained favorable, but the margin for error was razor thin. When drought struck the region in the mid-12th century, the entire network began to unravel. Communities that had devoted enormous resources to supporting Chacoan construction projects suddenly found themselves unable to feed their own populations. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals increasing violence and social upheaval. The systematic cannibalism documented at sites like Cowboy Wash occurred during Chaco's decline, suggesting that the collapse of centralized authority led to brutal conflicts over dwindling resources. Entire communities were wiped out, their remains processed and consumed by desperate survivors. The survivors of Chaco's collapse eventually reorganized into the Pueblo communities that Spanish explorers would later encounter, but they never again attempted the kind of monumental architecture that had characterized their ancestors. The memory of Chaco's failure seems to have served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unsustainable growth and social inequality. Similar stories emerge from archaeological sites across the Americas. At Spiro Mounds in Oklahoma, evidence suggests another spectacular collapse around 1450 CE. This was the center of what archaeologists call the Mississippian Interaction Sphere, a trade network that connected communities from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Spiro's elite controlled the flow of exotic materials throughout much of eastern North America. Copper from Michigan, shells from Florida, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, and precious stones from across the continent flowed through their hands. The wealth accumulated from this trade allowed them to commission elaborate artworks and maintain specialists who created some of the finest prehistoric art ever found north of Mexico. But this commercial empire was built on unstable foundations. The long-distance trade routes that brought wealth to Spiro also made the system vulnerable to disruption. When climate change and social upheaval affected distant regions, the effects rippled through the entire network. Communities that had specialized in producing trade goods found their markets disappearing. The elaborate redistribution systems that had maintained social order began to break down. The final abandonment of Spiro occurred suddenly, possibly within a single generation. The great mounds were deliberately desecrated, their contents scattered or destroyed. This wasn't gradual decline, but violent rejection of the entire social system. The survivors apparently held their former leaders responsible for the collapse and took revenge by destroying the symbols of their power. These cycles of rise and collapse weren't random events, but predictable consequences of how ancient American societies organized themselves. Archaeologists studying these patterns have identified common factors that made civilizations vulnerable to catastrophic failure. Most ancient American societies were organized as chiefdoms or early states dominated by hereditary elites who claimed special relationships with supernatural forces. These leaders justified their authority through elaborate rituals, monumental architecture, and displays of exotic wealth. As long as the system delivered prosperity and security, people accepted elite rule and contributed their labor to increasingly ambitious projects. But this social organization created inherent instabilities. Elite demands for tribute and labor typically increased over time, even as environmental conditions or external circumstances made it harder for common people to meet those demands. The leaders who benefited from the system had little incentive to moderate their requirements, while those who bore the costs had no voice in decision-making. When environmental stress or external threats pushed these societies to their breaking point, the centralized authority that had been their greatest strength became their fatal weakness. Decisions that might have saved the community were blocked by elites unwilling to sacrifice their privileges. Resources that could have been used for adaptation were instead devoted to ever more desperate attempts to maintain traditional power structures. The result was often sudden, complete collapse rather than gradual adaptation. Communities that had supported populations in the tens of thousands were abandoned within a few generations. Sophisticated technologies and knowledge systems were lost. Trade networks that had operated for centuries simply vanished. Understanding these ancient collapses has taken on new urgency as archaeologists recognize parallels with modern environmental and social challenges. Climate change, resource depletion, social inequality, and political polarization created the conditions for catastrophic failure in ancient America, just as they threatened contemporary societies. But there's another layer to this story that makes it even more relevant to our current moment. Many of the ancient American civilizations that collapsed weren't simply forgotten by later peoples. Their failures were deliberately erased from historical memory by European colonizers who found it convenient to portray the Americas as an empty wilderness waiting for civilization. This systematic erasure began almost immediately after European contact. Spanish conquistadors burned Maya libraries, destroying thousands of books that contained detailed records of Mesoamerican history, science, and literature. Only 4 Maya codices survived this cultural genocide, leaving us with fragmentary glimpses of what was once a vast body of written knowledge. French missionaries in eastern North America similarly destroyed indigenous historical records, viewing them as obstacles to Christian conversion. English colonists in New England dismissed the sophisticated earthworks they encountered as the products of a vanished race of white people, unable to accept that Native Americans were capable of such achievements. This process of historical erasure served obvious colonial purposes. If indigenous peoples had never developed complex civilizations, then European conquest could be portrayed as bringing progress to a backward continent rather than destroying sophisticated societies. The ruins of great cities were reinterpreted as natural formations or attributed to mysterious ancient peoples who had supposedly vanished long before Europeans arrived. The consequences of this systematic distortion extend far beyond academic archaeology. When indigenous achievements are erased from history, it becomes easier to justify continued marginalization and exploitation of native peoples. If their ancestors were primitive hunter-gatherers, then contemporary indigenous communities can be dismissed as having no legitimate claim to sophisticated political, legal, or intellectual traditions. This colonial narrative proved remarkably durable, persisting well into the 20th century, despite mounting archaeological evidence to the contrary. Even today, many Americans are unaware that their continent was once home to cities larger than medieval London or Paris. They don't know that indigenous peoples developed mathematical concepts like zero independently of Old World civilizations, or that Native American agricultural innovations like the Three Sisters planting method revolutionized food production worldwide. The suppression of this history has been so thorough that even many Native Americans have internalized colonial narratives about their own past. Generations of indigenous children were educated in schools that taught them their ancestors were primitive and uncivilized. Traditional knowledge systems were dismissed as superstition. Languages that encoded thousands of years of accumulated wisdom were banned and allowed to disappear. But archaeological discoveries continue to challenge these colonial narratives and reveal the true scope of ancient American achievements. Recent excavations at sites like Poverty Point and Watson Break in Louisiana have pushed back the dates for monumental architecture in North America by thousands of years. These earthworks were being built when Europeans were still living in small farming villages with no knowledge of writing or metallurgy. Sophisticated astronomical observatories, like the Goshen Pass petroglyphs in Virginia, demonstrate that ancient Americans were tracking celestial cycles with remarkable precision thousands of years before European contact. The calculations required for these observations involved mathematical concepts that wouldn't be developed in Europe until the Renaissance. Evidence for extensive trade networks continues to accumulate as archaeologists apply new analytical techniques to museum collections. Obsidian tools found in Ohio came from volcanic sources in Yellowstone, over 1,500 miles away. Copper artifacts discovered in Georgia were made from metal mined in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. These weren't occasional long-distance exchanges, but regular commercial relationships maintained over centuries. The scale of these ancient American achievements becomes even more impressive when we consider that they were accomplished without many technologies that Old World civilizations considered essential. Most indigenous American societies never developed widespread use of metal tools, the wheel, or large domesticated animals. Yet they built monuments that rival the pyramids of Egypt, created agricultural systems that supported millions of people, and established trade networks spanning entire continents. This technological minimalism wasn't a sign of backwardness, but evidence of sophisticated adaptation to local environments. Why develop wheeled vehicles when you live in mountainous terrain where human porters are more efficient? Why invest in metallurgy when stone tools can be made from abundant local materials and perform most necessary tasks just as well? Recent studies of indigenous agricultural practices have revealed innovations that surpass modern farming techniques in sustainability and productivity. The raised field systems developed in the Amazon basin could produce higher crop yields per acre than contemporary mechanized agriculture, while actually improving soil fertility over time. The terraced hillsides of the Andes prevented erosion and conserved water so effectively that many are still in use today. These achievements were the products of thousands of years of careful observation, experimentation, and accumulated knowledge. Indigenous peoples developed detailed understanding of local ecosystems, weather patterns, and plant genetics that allowed them to thrive in environments that challenged later European settlers. This knowledge was encoded in languages, stories, and ritual practices that preserved information across generations without need for written records. The loss of this traditional ecological knowledge represents one of the greatest intellectual catastrophes in human history. When European diseases and conquest devastated indigenous populations, they also destroyed information systems that had taken millennia to develop. Modern science is only beginning to rediscover principles of sustainable agriculture, medicine, and environmental management that were common knowledge among ancient American peoples. But perhaps the most significant loss was political and social. Many indigenous American societies had developed governmental systems that balanced individual freedom with collective decision-making in ways that European political philosophers could barely imagine. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy operated under a constitution that guaranteed rights for women, children, and future generations while maintaining unity among diverse communities across vast territories. These political innovations directly influenced the development of American democracy. Benjamin Franklin and other founders studied indigenous governmental systems and incorporated many of their principles into the Constitution. The federal structure of the United States, with power shared between local and national authorities, was based partly on Haudenosaunee models. Yet this indigenous contribution to American political development has been systematically erased from historical narratives. Textbooks credit European Enlightenment philosophers with inventing democratic principles while ignoring the living examples of democratic governance that existed throughout the Americas. The result is a distorted understanding of both American history and the origins of democratic institutions. The archaeological evidence for ancient American sophistication continues to accumulate, but changing public understanding of this history remains challenging. Colonial narratives have been reinforced by centuries of popular culture, educational systems, and political rhetoric that portrayed indigenous peoples as obstacles to progress rather than creators of advanced civilizations. Museums and textbooks are beginning to acknowledge indigenous achievements, but often in ways that still minimize their significance. Ancient American cities are described as ceremonial centers, rather than urban settlements. Sophisticated knowledge systems are dismissed as folklore or traditional beliefs, rather than science. Political institutions are characterized as tribal customs, rather than governmental innovations. This ongoing minimization serves contemporary political purposes, just as colonial erasure served historical ones. If indigenous peoples never developed complex civilizations, then their descendants can be denied the rights and recognition accorded to other nations. If traditional ecological knowledge is merely superstition, then it can be ignored in favor of industrial approaches that prioritize short-term profits over long-term sustainability. But the archaeological record tells a different story. Ancient America was home to some of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history. These societies developed innovations in agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, engineering, and governance that continue to influence the modern world. Their achievements were built through thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and careful adaptation to diverse environments. The collapse of many of these civilizations before European contact doesn't diminish their accomplishments, but rather provides crucial lessons about the factors that make societies vulnerable to catastrophic failure. Environmental stress, social inequality, and inflexible leadership created the conditions for dramatic collapse in ancient America, just as they threaten contemporary societies. Understanding this history is essential, not just for correcting colonial distortions, but for learning from both the successes and failures of ancient American peoples. Their innovations in sustainable agriculture, democratic governance, and environmental management offer models for addressing current global challenges. Their experiences with collapse provide warnings about the consequences of unsustainable growth and social inequality. The dark secrets of ancient America aren't just about what these civilizations accomplished or how they failed. They're about why this history has been systematically suppressed and what we lose when we allow colonial narratives to erase indigenous achievements from our collective memory. The archaeological record reveals another disturbing pattern that extends far beyond individual sites or cultures. Across ancient America, we find evidence of systematic violence that was woven into the very fabric of society. This wasn't random brutality or desperate survival tactics. It was organized, ritualized, and often carried out on an industrial scale that rivals the darkest chapters of Old World history. At Mesa Verde in Colorado, the cliff dwellings that tourists admire today tell only part of the story. Recent excavations in the surrounding area have uncovered evidence of warfare so intense that entire communities were wiped out within single generations. The famous cliff palaces weren't just architectural marvels. They were fortresses, built in locations that were nearly impossible to attack but also nearly impossible to escape from. The transition from open valley settlements to defensive cliff dwellings happened rapidly around 1200 CE, suggesting that violence erupted suddenly across the region. Archaeological evidence shows that communities abandoned carefully tended agricultural fields and retreated to positions where they could be easily besieged. The very architecture that makes Mesa Verde so striking today was born from terror and desperation. But the most chilling discoveries come from the settlements that didn't survive this period of conflict. At Castle Rock Pueblo, archaeologists uncovered evidence of a massacre that occurred around 1280 CE. The entire community, men, women, and children, were killed and their bodies systematically mutilated. The bone modifications are identical to those found at sites associated with cannibalism, suggesting the attackers consumed their victims after killing them. The violence wasn't random or chaotic. Cut marks on bones follow consistent patterns that suggest specialized knowledge of human anatomy. The processing was efficient and thorough, indicating this wasn't the first time the attackers had engaged in such activities. They knew exactly how to dismember human bodies for maximum meat recovery. Genetic analysis of the Castle Rock remains has revealed something even more disturbing. The victims weren't outsiders or enemies from distant communities. They were closely related to populations living throughout the Mesa Verde region. This wasn't warfare between different ethnic groups or competing tribes. It was neighbors killing and eating neighbors, possibly members of extended family networks turning on each other during times of extreme stress. The systematic nature of this violence suggests it was sanctioned by whatever social institutions remained functional during the collapse of ancestral Puebloan civilization. The attackers weren't rogue bands or desperate refugees. They were organized groups following established protocols for processing human remains. Someone had to teach them these techniques. Someone had to authorize their use against fellow community members. This evidence challenges romantic notions about ancient Native American societies, living in harmony with nature and each other. The ancestral Puebloans were sophisticated people who built remarkable cities and developed complex agricultural systems. They were also capable of systematic brutality against their own neighbors, when environmental stress and social breakdown created the conditions for such violence. The pattern repeats across ancient America with disturbing consistency. In California's Central Valley, the windmiller culture left behind mass graves containing hundreds of individuals who died violent deaths between 2500 and 1500 BCE. The victims show evidence of systematic torture, mutilation, and in some cases cannibalism. These weren't isolated incidents, but recurring patterns of violence that persisted for over 1,000 years. The perpetrators of this violence weren't primitive savages, but members of sophisticated societies that traded across vast distances and created elaborate art and ceremonial objects. They developed complex technologies for processing acorns and other native foods. They built substantial settlements and maintained extensive networks of social relationships. They were also capable of organized brutality on a scale that rivals anything from the ancient Mediterranean or medieval Europe. In the Pacific Northwest, the wealth and sophistication of cultures like the Haida and Tlingit is well documented through their elaborate art, complex social hierarchies, and impressive architectural achievements. Less well known is the systematic warfare and slave raiding that supported their economies. Archaeological evidence shows that these societies regularly captured and traded human beings as commodities, maintaining slave populations that could comprise up to 30% of some communities. The slaves weren't prisoners of war in the conventional sense, but economic assets that were systematically exploited for labor and traded between communities like any other valuable goods. They could be killed at will by their owners, and their deaths were often incorporated into ceremonial activities. At potlatch ceremonies, wealthy individuals would demonstrate their status by destroying valuable property, including human slaves. Recent analysis of skeletal remains from Pacific Northwest archaeological sites has revealed the physical consequences of this slave system. Individuals identified as likely slaves show evidence of chronic malnutrition, untreated injuries, and premature death. They were worked to death in conditions that were deliberately harsh, their suffering serving to reinforce the status of their owners. The sophistication of Northwest Coast cultures makes this systematic dehumanization even more disturbing. These were societies that created some of the most complex art in the world, developed intricate legal systems, and maintained oral traditions that preserved detailed historical knowledge across centuries. They were also willing to treat fellow human beings as expendable property, whose lives had value only as demonstrations of wealth and power. Moving south into California, the Chumash people developed one of the most complex hunter-gatherer societies ever documented. They built ocean-going plank boats, established extensive trade networks, and created astronomical observatories that tracked celestial cycles with remarkable precision. They also practiced systematic infanticide and maintained rigid social hierarchies enforced through violence and intimidation. Archaeological evidence from Chumash sites shows clear patterns of differential treatment based on social status. Elite burials contain elaborate grave goods and show evidence of careful preparation for the afterlife. Common burials are sparse and often show signs of violent death. The most disturbing evidence comes from sites where infant remains are found buried in refuse areas rather than formal cemeteries, suggesting systematic disposal of unwanted children. The infanticide wasn't random or desperate, but followed clear cultural patterns. Female infants were more likely to be killed than males, particularly in families that already had daughters. The practice was so common that it created detectable demographic imbalances in the archaeological record. Entire communities show evidence of artificially skewed sex ratios that could only result from systematic elimination of female children. This evidence contradicts popular narratives about indigenous California peoples living in ecological balance with their environment. The Chumash weren't managing their population through natural means, but through deliberate killing of their own children, according to cultural preferences that prioritize male offspring and elite family lineages. The pattern of systematic violence extends throughout ancient America, revealing dark aspects of sophisticated civilizations that challenge simple narratives about noble savages or peaceful ecological societies. These weren't primitive people driven to desperate acts by harsh environmental conditions. They were complex societies that developed cultural institutions supporting organized brutality as normal aspects of social life. In the Great Lakes region, the old copper culture created some of the earliest metalworking traditions in North America, producing sophisticated tools and ornaments from native copper sources between 3000 and 1000 BCE. They also engaged in systematic warfare that left clear traces in the archaeological record. Mass graves from this period contain dozens of individuals who died violent deaths, their bodies bearing evidence of club wounds, arrow injuries, and systematic mutilation. The violence wasn't episodic or reactive, but planned and organized. Weapons caches found at old copper sites suggest communities were preparing for large-scale conflicts years in advance. The copper tools that demonstrate their technological sophistication were also crafted into specialized weapons, designed specifically for killing human beings. These weren't multi-purpose implements adapted for warfare, but dedicated instruments of violence. Analysis of the skeletal remains reveals that the victims came from diverse backgrounds and age groups. Children, adults, and elderly individuals all show evidence of systematic killing. This wasn't warfare between competing groups of adult males, but deliberate massacre of entire communities. The attackers made no distinction between combatants and civilians, killing indiscriminately and processing the bodies according to established protocols. The systematic nature of this violence suggests it served important social functions beyond simple resource competition or territorial disputes. The elaborate processing of victims' remains, the careful arrangement of bodies in mass graves, and the inclusion of valuable grave goods with some burials indicate these killings were ritualized and meaningful within old copper cultural systems. Recent DNA analysis has begun to reveal the genetic consequences of this systematic violence. Populations from the Great Lakes region show evidence of severe bottlenecks during the Old Copper period, suggesting that large numbers of people were eliminated from the breeding population. Entire genetic lineages disappeared from the archaeological record, replaced by new populations with different ancestral backgrounds. This genetic evidence suggests that the violence wasn't just cultural conflict between related groups, but systematic genocide that eliminated entire populations and replaced them with genetically distinct peoples. The sophisticated old copper technologies and cultural traditions weren't gradually evolved by local populations, but were likely introduced by conquerors who had eliminated the previous inhabitants. The implications are staggering. Some of ancient America's most impressive technological achievements may have been built on foundations of systematic extermination and population replacement. The beautiful copper artifacts that we admire in museums today may have been created by societies that maintained their cultural traditions through deliberate genocide of competing populations. Similar patterns emerge when we examine the rise of Mississippian culture around 1000 CE. The elaborate ceremonial complexes, sophisticated art styles, and complex social hierarchies that characterize sites like Cahokia, Moundville, and Spiro didn't develop gradually from earlier traditions, but appeared suddenly across much of eastern North America. The rapid spread of Mississippian cultural elements suggests organized conquest and colonization rather than peaceful cultural diffusion. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Sites that were occupied continuously for centuries show sudden breaks in their cultural sequences around 1000 CE. Earlier pottery styles, house forms, and burial practices disappear abruptly, replaced by standardized Mississippian traditions. The transitions are too rapid and uniform to represent gradual cultural change. At many sites, the transition coincides with evidence of violence and destruction. Earlier structures were burned, defensive fortifications were built, and mass graves contain individuals who died violent deaths during the transition period. The arrival of Mississippian culture was often literally built on the bones of previous populations. The Mississippian expansion wasn't a peaceful spread of religious ideas or technological innovations, but a systematic conquest that eliminated existing cultural traditions and replaced them with standardized imperial forms. The elaborate ceremonial centers that we admire today were instruments of cultural domination, designed to overawe subject populations and demonstrate the power of their conquerors. This reinterpretation of Mississippian culture challenges fundamental assumptions about how complex societies developed in ancient America. Rather than representing the natural evolution of local traditions, many of the continent's most impressive archaeological sites may be evidence of successful imperial conquest and cultural colonization. The Spanish conquistadors, who destroyed the Aztec and Inca empires, were following patterns of imperial expansion that had been established in the Americas for thousands of years. The systematic elimination of local traditions, the replacement of indigenous leadership with imperial administrators, and the extraction of tribute and labor from subject populations were ancient American practices long before Europeans arrived. But while Spanish conquest is well documented in historical sources, the earlier episodes of indigenous imperialism must be reconstructed from archaeological evidence alone. The victims of these ancient conquests left no written records of their suffering. Their stories survive only in the bones and artifacts that archaeologists painstakingly extract from the earth. The scale of these prehistoric conquests becomes clear when we map the distribution of cultural traditions across ancient America. Standardized art styles, pottery forms, and architectural techniques spread across thousands of miles with a uniformity that can only be explained by organized political control. Local variations that had developed over centuries were systematically eliminated and replaced with imperial standards. At Moundville in Alabama, the sequence of construction reveals how Mississippian imperialism operated in practice. Earlier mounds were torn down and rebuilt according to standardized plans. Local pottery traditions were abandoned in favor of imperial styles. Burial practices that had been maintained for generations were replaced with new forms that emphasized hierarchical distinctions between social classes. The transformation wasn't gradual or voluntary, but rapid and coercive. Radiocarbon dates show that the changes occurred within a few generations, too quickly for natural cultural evolution. The uniformity of the new traditions across vast distances indicates they were imposed by external authorities rather than adopted through local innovation. Similar evidence appears at Mississippian sites throughout the Southeast and Midwest. Local cultural traditions that had persisted for centuries were systematically eliminated and replaced with standardized imperial forms. The diversity that had characterized earlier periods gave way to monotonous uniformity that served imperial administrative needs. The human cost of this cultural standardization is visible in the archaeological record. Cemeteries from the early Mississippian period contain unusually large numbers of individuals who died violent deaths. Many show evidence of systematic torture and execution. These weren't battle casualties, but deliberate killings designed to terrorize local populations into submission. At the Larson site in South Dakota, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave containing over 500 individuals who were systematically killed during the Mississippian expansion. Men, women, and children were tortured, mutilated, and executed according to standardized protocols. The killings weren't random violence, but organized genocide designed to eliminate potential resistance to imperial rule. The victims at Larson represent just one documented example of Mississippian imperial violence. Similar mass graves have been found at sites throughout the region, suggesting that systematic massacre was a standard tool of Mississippian expansion. Entire communities were eliminated to make room for imperial colonists who would implement standardized cultural practices. The archaeological evidence for systematic violence in ancient America extends far beyond individual sites or specific time periods. It represents a consistent pattern of organized brutality that was woven into the fabric of complex societies throughout the continent. The same civilizations that created magnificent art and impressive architecture also developed sophisticated techniques for systematically killing and processing human beings. This evidence challenges romantic notions about ancient American societies, but it also reveals the remarkable sophistication of these cultures. The systematic nature of the violence, the standardized techniques for processing victims, and the organized distribution of human remains suggest complex institutional structures that could coordinate activities across vast territories and long time periods. The rituals surrounding human sacrifice and cannibalism required specialized knowledge that had to be transmitted across generations. Someone had to train the priests and executioners who carried out these activities. Someone had to maintain the cultural traditions that justified and regulated the killing. Someone had to organize the logistics of capturing, transporting, and processing victims on the massive scales documented in the archaeological record. These institutional structures were as sophisticated as anything found in ancient civilizations anywhere in the world. The systematic nature of violence in ancient America represents remarkable organizational achievements, even as it reveals the dark purposes to which those achievements were directed. Understanding this complexity is essential for grasping the full scope of what was lost when European diseases and conquest devastated indigenous populations. The societies that collapsed weren't simple hunter-gatherer bands, but complex civilizations with sophisticated institutions, accumulated knowledge systems, and cultural traditions that had developed over thousands of years. The violence that characterized many of these societies doesn't diminish their achievements, but rather demonstrates their full humanity. Ancient Americans were capable of remarkable cruelty and remarkable creativity, often within the same cultural systems. They developed complex technologies and organized systematic brutality with equal sophistication. This nuanced understanding of ancient American societies provides crucial context for interpreting the colonial period and its aftermath. The Spanish conquistadors who destroyed the Aztec Empire weren't bringing civilization to primitive savages, but conquering sophisticated societies that had their own long histories of imperial expansion and systematic violence. The diseases that devastated indigenous populations didn't just kill individuals, but destroyed complex institutional knowledge that had taken thousands of years to develop. The techniques for organizing large-scale construction projects, managing extensive trade networks, and coordinating systematic ritual activities were lost, along with the people who maintained these traditions. The cultural genocide that accompanied European colonization eliminated not just languages and religious practices, but also sophisticated knowledge systems that had no equivalents in European traditions. The astronomical observations that allowed ancient Americans to predict eclipses and track celestial cycles represented scientific achievements that were destroyed along with the societies that created them. Modern archaeology is gradually reconstructing these lost knowledge systems, but the process is slow and incomplete. Much of what ancient Americans knew about their environment, their history, and their social organization was never written down, but was preserved in oral traditions that died with their carriers. The dark secrets of ancient America aren't just about what these civilizations accomplished or how they failed. They're about the systematic suppression of evidence that challenged colonial narratives about primitive peoples waiting for European civilization. The evidence for indigenous sophistication was always there in the archaeological record, but it was consistently reinterpreted through frameworks that minimized Native American achievements. This reinterpretation served obvious political purposes during the colonial period, but it has persisted long after the original justifications disappeared. Contemporary Americans continue to learn distorted versions of their continent's history that ignore or minimize the sophisticated civilizations that existed before European contact. The consequences extend far beyond academic archaeology or museum displays. When indigenous achievements are erased from historical memory, it becomes easier to ignore the knowledge systems and cultural traditions that survived the colonial catastrophe. Traditional ecological practices that sustained large populations for thousands of years are dismissed as primitive when they could provide crucial insights for addressing contemporary environmental challenges. Political institutions that balanced individual freedom with collective decision-making are ignored when they could offer alternatives to the polarized democracy that characterizes contemporary American politics. Agricultural techniques that increased productivity while improving soil fertility are overlooked when they could revolutionize sustainable food production. The systematic suppression of ancient American history represents not just historical injustice, but ongoing intellectual impoverishment. We continue to lose access to knowledge systems that took thousands of years to develop and could provide crucial guidance for addressing the challenges facing contemporary society. But the archaeological record continues to accumulate evidence that challenges colonial narratives and reveals the true scope of ancient American achievements. Each new discovery adds to our understanding of the sophisticated civilizations that once flourished across this continent. Each analysis of museum collections reveals new evidence of ancient American innovations and accomplishments. The dark secrets of ancient America are finally being brought into the light. Not just the violence and systematic brutality that characterized many of these societies, but also the remarkable achievements that colonial narratives systematically obscured. Understanding both aspects of this history is essential for grasping the full complexity of the civilizations that shaped this continent long before Europeans arrived. The story that emerges from this evidence isn't simple or comfortable, but it's far more interesting and ultimately more useful than the sanitized narratives that have dominated popular understanding. Ancient Americans were fully human, capable of both remarkable cruelty and remarkable creativity. Their successes and failures offer crucial lessons for contemporary society, but only if we're willing to acknowledge the full complexity of their achievements and the systematic suppression of evidence about their sophisticated civilizations. The systematic erasure of indigenous achievements wasn't limited to North America. In South America, the Spanish encountered civilizations that surpassed European technology in ways that colonial authorities found deeply threatening. The Inca road system stretched over 25,000 miles across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth, connecting an empire that spanned modern-day Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, and parts of Argentina and Colombia. These weren't crude mountain paths, but engineered highways with standardized widths, drainage systems, and rest stations spaced at precise intervals. Inca engineers carved tunnels through solid rock, built suspension bridges across impossible gorges, and constructed stone staircases that climbed vertical cliff faces. The road network was so sophisticated that Spanish colonial administrators continued using it for centuries after the conquest, unable to improve upon indigenous engineering. But acknowledging Inca engineering prowess raised uncomfortable questions about European technological superiority. How could supposedly primitive people build infrastructure that Spanish engineers couldn't replicate? How could a civilization without wheeled vehicles create transportation networks more efficient than anything in Europe? The solution was systematic minimization of Inca achievements in colonial records and later historical accounts. Spanish chroniclers consistently described Inca accomplishments in ways that emphasized what they lacked, rather than what they had achieved. The absence of written language was stressed, while ignoring the sophisticated quipu recording system that preserved detailed information about everything from census data to historical events. The lack of iron tools was highlighted while overlooking the precision stonework that required techniques European masons couldn't duplicate. This pattern of selective reporting created distorted historical narratives that persisted for centuries. Even today, most people are unaware that Inca agricultural terraces increased crop yields, while preventing erosion so effectively that many are still productive after 500 years. Modern engineers studying these systems have discovered innovations in water management and soil conservation that surpass contemporary techniques. The systematic suppression becomes even more apparent when we examine what happened to indigenous astronomical knowledge. Throughout the Americas, native peoples had developed sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles that allowed them to create accurate calendars, predict eclipses, and track planetary movements with remarkable precision. At Chichen Itza, the Caracol Observatory demonstrates mathematical and astronomical knowledge that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. The building's windows are precisely aligned to track the movements of Venus, whose cycles the Maya calculated more accurately than European astronomers. The famous Kukulkan Pyramid incorporates complex calculations about the solar year, with shadows cast by its steps, marking the equinoxes with perfect precision. Yet Spanish colonial authorities systematically destroyed Maya astronomical texts, burning thousands of codices that contained centuries of accumulated scientific knowledge. Only 4 Maya books survived this cultural genocide, leaving us with fragmentary glimpses of what was once a vast body of written science. The destruction wasn't accidental, but deliberate policy designed to eliminate indigenous knowledge systems that challenged European claims to intellectual superiority. Bishop Diego de Landa, who ordered the burning of Maya libraries in 1562, explicitly stated that indigenous books contained superstition and lies of the devil. The real threat wasn't supernatural, but intellectual. Maya astronomy was more accurate than European calculations, a fact that undermined colonial narratives about bringing enlightenment to primitive peoples. Similar patterns of systematic destruction occurred throughout the Americas. In Peru, Spanish authorities burned thousands of quipu records, eliminating detailed historical and administrative information that the Inca had preserved for centuries. These weren't primitive memory aids, but sophisticated recording systems that could store complex numerical data and narrative information. Recent analysis of surviving quipus has revealed their remarkable sophistication. The knots, colors, and spatial arrangements encode mathematical relationships that demonstrate advanced understanding of statistics, accounting, and data management. Some quipus appear to record astronomical observations, others contain what may be historical narratives or legal documents. The systematic destruction of these records represents one of the greatest losses of scientific and historical information in human history. The knowledge contained in destroyed quipus likely included detailed records of Inca engineering techniques, agricultural innovations, and administrative systems that could provide valuable insights for contemporary development projects. But acknowledging the sophistication of indigenous recording systems would have undermined fundamental assumptions about European cultural superiority. Colonial authorities needed to portray Native Americans as illiterate and primitive to justify conquest and forced conversion. The existence of complex information storage systems contradicted these narratives and had to be eliminated. The same logic drove the systematic destruction of indigenous educational institutions. When Spanish conquistadors entered Tenochtitlan, they found schools that educated thousands of students in mathematics, astronomy, history, and literature. The Calmecac, elite schools for training priests and administrators, provided education that was more comprehensive than anything available in Europe at the time. These institutions were systematically destroyed and replaced with colonial schools designed to eliminate indigenous knowledge systems rather than preserve them. Students who had been studying advanced mathematics and astronomy were forced to learn European catechism and basic literacy in Spanish. Generations of accumulated knowledge were lost within a few decades of conquest. The destruction extended beyond formal education to include the systematic elimination of indigenous languages that encoded sophisticated knowledge systems. Many Native American languages contain detailed vocabularies for describing environmental phenomena, mathematical concepts, and astronomical observations that had no equivalents in European languages. When these languages were suppressed in colonial schools and missions, the knowledge they preserved was lost along with the words that expressed it. Contemporary linguists studying surviving indigenous languages continue to discover concepts and categories that reveal sophisticated understanding of ecology, meteorology, and other scientific disciplines. The Inuktitut language of Arctic peoples, for example, contains dozens of terms for different types of snow and ice conditions that allow precise communication about environmental conditions essential for survival. These aren't primitive descriptive terms, but technical vocabulary that encodes centuries of accumulated knowledge about Arctic ecology. Similarly, many indigenous languages of the Amazon contain detailed taxonomies for classifying plants and animals that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of biological relationships. Some contain mathematical concepts that express complex relationships in ways that are more precise than European terminology. The systematic suppression of these languages eliminated vast bodies of technical knowledge that had been accumulated over thousands of years. Contemporary scientists working in fields like ecology, climatology, and pharmacology are gradually rediscovering principles that were common knowledge among indigenous peoples before European contact. But this rediscovery process is slow and incomplete because the languages that preserve this knowledge are extinct or nearly extinct. The knowledge systems that allowed indigenous peoples to thrive in challenging environments for thousands of years have been largely lost, leaving contemporary society to reinvent solutions to problems that had already been solved. The scale of this intellectual destruction becomes clear when we examine specific examples of lost indigenous innovations. In the Pacific Northwest, indigenous peoples developed techniques for managing forest ecosystems that maintained biological diversity while producing sustainable yields of timber, food, and other resources. These techniques were so effective that forests managed by indigenous peoples contained higher biodiversity than untouched wilderness areas. The management systems involved controlled burning, selective harvesting, and careful timing of resource extraction that enhanced rather than degraded ecosystem health. Contemporary forest managers are gradually rediscovering these techniques, but only after decades of industrial forestry that severely damaged the ecosystems indigenous peoples had maintained for thousands of years. Similar patterns appear throughout the Americas. Indigenous agricultural systems that supported large populations without depleting soil fertility were replaced with European techniques that caused widespread erosion and degradation. Water management systems that prevented flooding while maintaining ecosystem health were abandoned in favor of engineering approaches that created more problems than they solved. The systematic replacement of indigenous knowledge systems with European alternatives represents not just cultural imperialism, but practical catastrophe. Many contemporary environmental and social problems result directly from the abandonment of sustainable practices that indigenous peoples had refined over millennia. Climate change, soil degradation, water pollution, and biodiversity loss are all problems that indigenous knowledge systems had successfully addressed. The traditional ecological practices that sustained large populations for thousands of years were specifically designed to maintain long-term ecosystem health while providing for human needs. But acknowledging the superiority of indigenous environmental management would require admitting that European colonization was environmentally destructive rather than progressive. Colonial narratives portrayed European agriculture and resource extraction as improvements over primitive indigenous practices, even when the evidence clearly demonstrated the opposite. This systematic distortion of environmental history continues to influence contemporary policy debates. Industrial agriculture is promoted as necessary for feeding large populations, despite evidence that indigenous farming techniques were more productive and sustainable. Forest clear-cutting is justified as economic development, despite evidence that indigenous forest management produced higher long-term yields while maintaining ecosystem health. The consequences extend beyond environmental degradation to include the loss of knowledge systems that could address contemporary social challenges. Many indigenous societies had developed sophisticated approaches to conflict resolution, community decision-making, and resource distribution that balanced individual rights with collective needs. The Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace, for example, established governmental structures that guaranteed representation for all community members while maintaining unity across diverse populations. Women held positions of authority that had no equivalence in European political systems. Decisions affecting future generations were evaluated according to their impact 7 generations into the future. These political innovations directly influenced the development of American democracy, but their indigenous origins have been systematically erased from historical narratives. The founders of the United States studied and borrowed from indigenous governmental systems, but textbooks credit European political philosophers with innovations that were actually developed by Native American peoples. The erasure serves contemporary political purposes just as it served colonial ones. If indigenous peoples never developed sophisticated political systems, then their descendants can be denied the sovereignty and self-determination accorded to other nations. If traditional governmental structures were primitive and ineffective, then they can be ignored in favor of European-derived institutions. But archaeological and historical evidence reveals that many indigenous political systems were more democratic and inclusive than their European counterparts. Women participated in decision-making processes that excluded them from European politics until the 20th century. Community members had voice in decisions that affected them in ways that weren't available in European monarchies or early republics. The systematic suppression of this evidence represents ongoing intellectual impoverishment that affects contemporary society in multiple ways. Political institutions that balanced individual freedom with collective responsibility could provide alternatives to the polarized democracy that characterizes contemporary American politics. Conflict resolution techniques that emphasized restoration rather than punishment could address problems in contemporary criminal justice systems. environmental management practices that maintained ecosystem health while supporting large populations could provide crucial guidance for addressing climate change and resource depletion. Agricultural techniques that increased productivity while improving soil fertility could revolutionize sustainable food production. But accessing this knowledge requires acknowledging the systematic suppression of indigenous achievements and working to reconstruct knowledge systems that were deliberately destroyed. The process involves not just correcting historical narratives, but actively seeking out and learning from surviving indigenous knowledge holders. Contemporary indigenous communities continue to maintain fragments of traditional knowledge systems despite centuries of systematic suppression. Elders who learned from previous generations before complete cultural disruption occurred still preserve information about sustainable practices, conflict resolution techniques, and environmental management approaches. But this knowledge is disappearing rapidly as older generations pass away without full transmission to younger community members. Languages that encode traditional knowledge are becoming extinct. Cultural practices that maintain knowledge transmission across generations have been disrupted by forced assimilation and cultural suppression. The loss represents not just tragedy for indigenous communities, but intellectual catastrophe for contemporary society. The knowledge systems that allowed indigenous peoples to thrive sustainably for thousands of years could provide crucial guidance for addressing contemporary challenges, but only if systematic efforts are made to preserve and learn from surviving traditional knowledge. Recent developments in archaeological science continue to reveal the true scope of ancient American achievements and the extent of their systematic suppression in historical narratives. Ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery have identified hundreds of previously unknown sites that demonstrate the sophistication of pre-Columbian civilizations. In the Amazon basin, LiDAR technology has revealed massive earthworks and urban settlements that supported populations in the millions. These weren't primitive villages, but planned cities with sophisticated water management systems, agricultural terraces, and monumental architecture that rivals anything found in contemporary Old World civilizations. The settlements were organized according to complex urban planning principles that integrated residential areas with agricultural zones and ceremonial centers. Road networks connected distant communities and facilitated trade relationships spanning thousands of miles. The scale and sophistication of these urban complexes challenges fundamental assumptions about the development of complex society in tropical environments. Yet these discoveries have received minimal attention in popular media or educational curricula. The evidence contradicts colonial narratives about the Amazon as an empty wilderness inhabited only by small bands of primitive hunter-gatherers. Acknowledging the true scale of ancient Amazonian civilization would require admitting that European colonization destroyed sophisticated urban societies rather than bringing civilization to empty lands. Similar suppression characterizes the treatment of North American archaeological discoveries. Recent excavations at Cahokia have revealed urban planning and engineering that surpassed contemporary European cities, but this evidence rarely appears in textbooks or popular histories. The sophisticated astronomical observations and mathematical calculations demonstrated by ancient American monuments are consistently downplayed or ignored. The pattern extends to treatment of indigenous technological innovations that were adopted and improved by European colonists. Corn cultivation techniques developed by indigenous peoples revolutionized global agriculture and allowed population growth that supported European expansion. Canoe designs perfected by Native Americans became the basis for transportation networks throughout colonial America. Medical knowledge possessed by indigenous peoples provided treatments for diseases that European medicine couldn't address. Surgical techniques practiced by Native American healers surpassed European medical practice in many areas. Pharmaceutical innovations based on indigenous plant knowledge became the foundation for modern drug development. Yet these contributions are consistently minimized or attributed to European innovation rather than indigenous knowledge. The narrative of European settlers bringing civilization to primitive peoples persists despite overwhelming evidence that colonists depended on indigenous knowledge and technology for survival and success. The systematic suppression serves contemporary political and economic interests, just as it served colonial ones. If indigenous knowledge systems are primitive and ineffective, then their destruction can be justified as necessary progress. If traditional ecological practices are unscientific, then they can be ignored in favor of industrial approaches that prioritize short-term profits over long-term sustainability. If indigenous political systems were undemocratic and oppressive, then contemporary marginalization of Native American sovereignty can be portrayed as liberation rather than continued colonization. The distorted historical narratives that justified original conquest continue to justify ongoing dispossession and cultural destruction. But the archaeological record continues to accumulate evidence that challenges these narratives and reveals the true sophistication of ancient American civilizations. Each new discovery adds to our understanding of the complex societies that flourished throughout the Americas before European contact. Each analysis reveals innovations and achievements that were systematically suppressed in colonial accounts. The evidence demonstrates that ancient Americans developed sophisticated solutions to problems that continue to challenge contemporary society. Their achievements in sustainable agriculture, urban planning, environmental management, and social organization represent accumulated wisdom that could provide crucial guidance for addressing current global challenges. Understanding this history requires acknowledging both the remarkable achievements of ancient American civilizations and the systematic violence that characterized many of these societies. The same cultures that developed sophisticated technologies and sustainable practices also engaged in warfare, human sacrifice, and systematic brutality on scales that rival the darkest chapters of Old World history. But acknowledging this complexity doesn't diminish indigenous achievements or justify colonial destruction. Ancient Americans were fully human, capable of both remarkable creativity and systematic cruelty. Their successes and failures offer crucial lessons for contemporary society, but only if we're willing to move beyond colonial narratives that portrayed them as either noble savages living in primitive harmony or bloodthirsty barbarians incapable of civilization. The real story of ancient America is far more complex and ultimately more instructive than either romanticized or demonized versions. These were sophisticated societies with their own long histories of innovation, expansion, conflict, and cultural development. They created remarkable achievements and engaged in systematic violence, often within the same cultural systems. Learning from this history requires honest acknowledgement of both aspects while recognizing the systematic suppression of evidence that challenged colonial narratives. The dark secrets of ancient America aren't just about what these civilizations accomplished or how they failed, but about the ongoing suppression of knowledge that could provide crucial guidance for contemporary challenges. The archaeological record continues to reveal evidence of ancient American sophistication, despite centuries of systematic suppression and distortion. Each new discovery challenges colonial narratives and demonstrates the remarkable achievements of indigenous peoples long before European contact. Understanding this evidence is essential not just for historical accuracy, but for accessing knowledge systems that could address contemporary global challenges. The systematic suppression of ancient American history represents ongoing intellectual impoverishment that affects all aspects of contemporary society. Environmental management practices, agricultural techniques, political institutions, and conflict resolution approaches developed by indigenous peoples over thousands of years were deliberately destroyed and replaced with European alternatives that often proved less effective and sustainable. Recovering this lost knowledge requires acknowledging the systematic nature of its suppression and working actively to reconstruct knowledge systems that were deliberately destroyed. The process involves not just correcting historical narratives, but seeking out and learning from surviving indigenous knowledge holders who maintain fragments of traditional wisdom. But time is running out. Languages that encode traditional knowledge are disappearing rapidly. Elders who learned from previous generations before complete cultural disruption are passing away without full transmission to younger community members. Cultural practices that maintained knowledge transmission across generations have been disrupted by centuries of forced assimilation and cultural suppression. The loss represents tragedy, not just for indigenous communities, but for all of humanity. The knowledge systems that allowed ancient Americans to thrive sustainably for thousands of years while developing sophisticated technologies and social institutions represent accumulated wisdom that could provide crucial guidance for addressing contemporary challenges. Climate change, environmental degradation, social inequality, and political polarization are all problems that indigenous knowledge systems successfully addressed over millennia. The traditional practices that sustained large populations while maintaining ecosystem health were specifically designed to balance human needs with long-term environmental stability. The governmental institutions that balanced individual freedom with collective decision-making while maintaining unity across diverse populations could provide alternatives to contemporary political systems that seem increasingly unable to address complex challenges requiring long-term thinking and cooperative action. But accessing this knowledge requires moving beyond colonial narratives that portrayed indigenous peoples as primitive obstacles to progress, rather than creators of sophisticated civilizations with valuable knowledge to offer contemporary society. The systematic suppression of ancient American achievements serves contemporary political and economic interests, just as it served colonial ones. Acknowledging the true sophistication of pre-Columbian civilizations challenges fundamental assumptions about progress, development, and the relationship between technology and sustainability. It requires admitting that European colonization often destroyed more effective and sustainable systems, rather than bringing improvement to primitive societies. The evidence continues to accumulate despite ongoing suppression efforts. Archaeological discoveries reveal ancient American achievements that surpass contemporary accomplishments in many areas. Linguistic research uncovers sophisticated knowledge systems encoded in indigenous languages. Ethnographic studies document traditional practices that solve problems contemporary society struggles to address. The dark secrets of ancient America are finally being brought into the light, revealing both the remarkable achievements and systematic violence that characterize these complex civilizations. Understanding this full complexity is essential for learning from both their successes and failures, while acknowledging the ongoing suppression of knowledge that could provide crucial guidance for contemporary challenges. The story that emerges isn't simple or comfortable, but it's far more interesting and ultimately more useful than sanitized narratives that have dominated popular understanding. Ancient Americans created sophisticated civilizations that offer both inspiration and warning for contemporary society, but only if we're willing to acknowledge their full complexity and the systematic suppression of evidence about their achievements. The evidence we've uncovered tonight represents just the tip of an archaeological iceberg that continues to grow larger with each passing year. But there's something deeply unsettling about how this information reaches the public, or more accurately, how it doesn't reach the public at all. Walk into any American classroom today and ask students what they know about ancient civilizations. They'll tell you about Egypt's pyramids, Rome's aqueducts, China's Great Wall. Ask them about ancient America, and you'll get blank stares or maybe a mention of teepees and buffalo hunts. This isn't accidental ignorance. It's the result of systematic educational policies that have shaped American consciousness for over a century. The textbook industry in the United States operates under what educators call the Texas effect. Because Texas purchases textbooks in such massive quantities, publishers tailor their content to meet Texas educational standards, which then get distributed nationwide. For decades, Texas educational boards dominated by specific political and religious interests have mandated that American history begin essentially with European contact. Indigenous achievements that predate European arrival are relegated to brief introductory chapters that most teachers skip due to time constraints. When ancient American civilizations are mentioned at all, they're presented as curiosities, rather than serious historical subjects worthy of detailed study. The message is clear. Real American history begins with European colonization. This educational framework serves obvious political purposes. If students learn that sophisticated civilizations existed throughout the Americas for thousands of years before European contact, it becomes harder to justify the narrative of European settlers bringing civilization to an empty wilderness. If they understand that indigenous peoples had developed advanced technologies and complex governmental systems, contemporary claims about European cultural superiority become questionable. The distortion extends beyond formal education into popular culture and media representation. Hollywood films consistently portray pre-Columbian America as populated by small bands of primitive hunter-gatherers living in temporary camps. Television documentaries about ancient civilizations focus almost exclusively on Old World cultures, while ignoring equally impressive American achievements. When ancient American sites are featured in popular media, they're often presented through frameworks that minimize indigenous accomplishments. Cahokia is described as a ceremonial center rather than a major city. Chaco Canyon is portrayed as a religious complex rather than the administrative capital of a vast trading empire. The language consistently downplays the urban, political, and economic sophistication of these sites. This linguistic manipulation shapes public understanding in subtle but powerful ways. A ceremonial center suggests spiritual activities by simple peoples. A major city implies complex administration, diverse populations, and sophisticated infrastructure. By choosing the first term over the second, media representations maintain colonial narratives while technically acknowledging archaeological evidence. Recent developments in digital archaeology have begun to circumvent traditional gatekeepers of historical information. LiDAR surveys conducted by independent researchers have revealed massive urban complexes throughout the Amazon that dwarf anything acknowledged in mainstream archaeological literature. Satellite imagery analysis by citizen scientists has identified hundreds of previously unknown earthwork sites across North America. These discoveries are being published in open-access journals and shared through social media platforms that bypass traditional academic publishing. The evidence is becoming impossible to ignore or suppress, but institutional responses have been telling. Major universities have been slow to incorporate new findings into their curricula. Museum exhibitions continue to present pre-Columbian America through frameworks established decades ago. The resistance isn't just academic inertia, but reflects deeper institutional interests in maintaining established narratives. Universities depend on government funding and private donations that often come with implicit expectations about how American history should be presented. Museums rely on visitor fees and corporate sponsorships that could be threatened by exhibitions that challenge popular misconceptions about indigenous peoples. Archaeological departments face particular pressures because their work often takes place on land controlled by government agencies or private corporations, with interests in maintaining legal and political status quo. Findings that demonstrate sophisticated indigenous land use and management could complicate contemporary disputes over resource extraction, land rights, and environmental protection. The Kennewick Man controversy illustrates how these pressures operate in practice. When archaeologists discovered 9,000-year-old remains in Washington state, initial analysis suggested the individual had physical features that differed from contemporary Native American populations. Some researchers argued this evidence supported theories about multiple waves of ancient migration to the Americas. Native American tribes claimed the remains under federal repatriation laws, arguing that all ancient human remains found on their ancestral territories should be returned for burial regardless of their apparent ethnic affiliations. The resulting legal battle lasted over 2 decades and involved multiple court cases, congressional hearings, and heated academic debates. The controversy revealed fundamental disagreements about who has authority to interpret ancient American history? Should scientific analysis take precedence over indigenous cultural and religious claims? Do contemporary Native American communities have the right to control access to archaeological evidence from their ancestral territories? How should conflicts between scientific and cultural interests be resolved? These questions become even more complex when we consider the broader political context. Native American sovereignty claims often depend on demonstrating continuous occupation of specific territories over long time periods. Archaeological evidence that suggests complex population movements, cultural changes, or territorial shifts could potentially undermine contemporary legal and political claims. The result is an uneasy tension between scientific research and political advocacy that affects how ancient American history gets presented to the public. Archaeologists working on indigenous sites must navigate complex relationships with tribal governments, federal agencies, and academic institutions that often have conflicting interests and priorities. Some researchers have responded by avoiding controversial topics entirely. Studies of ancient warfare, population movements, and cultural conflicts are less likely to be funded or published than research focusing on artistic achievements, environmental adaptation, or cultural continuity. The effect is to sanitize ancient American history in ways that serve contemporary political purposes, while limiting scientific understanding. But the most systematic suppression involves evidence that challenges fundamental assumptions about technological development and cultural evolution. Archaeological discoveries that demonstrate advanced ancient American achievements in areas where European societies supposedly held advantages create particular problems for established historical narratives. The Antikythera mechanism, an ancient Greek device for calculating astronomical positions, is celebrated as evidence of remarkable technological sophistication. Similar complexity in ancient American astronomical devices receives minimal attention or is dismissed as coincidental. The bias is subtle but consistent. Old World technological achievements are highlighted, while New World accomplishments are downplayed. This double standard becomes apparent when examining how archaeological evidence gets interpreted and presented. European Bronze Age sites with evidence of metallurgy, trade networks, and social stratification are described as complex civilizations. American sites with equivalent or superior evidence in the same areas are labeled chiefdoms or complex hunter-gatherers. The terminological distinction serves to maintain hierarchical assumptions about cultural development. Civilizations are understood to be more advanced and sophisticated than chiefdoms, regardless of the actual evidence for technological innovation, social organization, or cultural achievement. The language shapes public understanding in ways that preserve European claims to cultural superiority. Recent genetic studies have begun to challenge another fundamental assumption about ancient American history. DNA analysis of ancient remains suggests that indigenous American populations were far more diverse and mobile than traditional narratives acknowledged. Complex patterns of migration, cultural exchange, and population mixing characterized the pre-Columbian period. This evidence contradicts romantic notions about indigenous peoples living in isolated harmony with specific landscapes over thousands of years. It also challenges legal frameworks that assume contemporary tribal boundaries reflect ancient territorial divisions. The genetic data suggests ancient American history was characterized by the same kinds of population movements, cultural conflicts, and territorial changes that characterized Old World civilizations. But presenting this evidence requires careful navigation of contemporary political sensitivities. Genetic studies that suggest ancient population movements could be used to question contemporary indigenous land claims. Research demonstrating ancient warfare and territorial conflicts might be cited to justify historical dispossession. Even scientific evidence can become weaponized in political disputes. The challenge for researchers and educators is how to present accurate historical information while avoiding contributing to contemporary injustices. Ancient American history was complex and often violent. But acknowledging this complexity shouldn't be used to justify colonial destruction or contemporary marginalization of indigenous peoples. The solution requires sophisticated understanding of how historical narratives function in contemporary political contexts. Acknowledging ancient American warfare doesn't justify European conquest any more than acknowledging European medieval violence justifies contemporary invasion of European countries. Historical complexity should inform rather than determine contemporary political relationships. But achieving this sophisticated understanding requires educational systems that present ancient American history with the same depth and nuance accorded to other world civilizations. Students need to learn about both the achievements and failures of pre-Columbian societies, while understanding how colonial narratives shaped subsequent historical interpretation. The archaeological evidence continues to accumulate despite institutional pressures to maintain simplified narratives. Ground-penetrating radar surveys reveal urban complexes beneath sites that were previously thought to contain only simple villages. Isotope analysis of ancient remains demonstrates trade networks and population movements that spanned continents. Genetic studies reveal cultural and biological diversity that challenges assumptions about ancient American societies. Each new discovery adds to our understanding of the sophisticated civilizations that flourished throughout the Americas before European contact. The evidence demonstrates technological innovations, social institutions, and cultural achievements that rival anything found in ancient Old World civilizations. But translating this archaeological evidence into public understanding requires confronting the systematic suppression that has shaped American historical consciousness for centuries. The process involves more than just correcting factual errors or updating textbook content. It requires fundamental changes in how American identity gets constructed and maintained. If indigenous peoples created sophisticated civilizations that were destroyed by European colonization, then American national narratives based on bringing civilization to empty wilderness become untenable. If ancient American technological innovations and social institutions were superior in many ways to their European counterparts, then assumptions about Western cultural superiority require re-examination. If indigenous knowledge systems contain solutions to problems that contemporary society struggles to address, then marginalization of Native American communities represents ongoing intellectual impoverishment. These implications extend far beyond academic archaeology or museum exhibitions. They touch on fundamental questions about American identity, historical memory, and contemporary political relationships. Understanding ancient American history accurately requires confronting uncomfortable truths about colonial destruction and ongoing suppression of indigenous knowledge. But the archaeological record offers hope as well as challenge. The evidence demonstrates human capacity for remarkable innovation and adaptation under diverse environmental and social conditions. Ancient American achievements in sustainable agriculture, environmental management, and social organization provide models for addressing contemporary global challenges. The sophisticated astronomical observations and mathematical calculations demonstrated by ancient American monuments reveal scientific knowledge that developed independently of Old World influences. The urban planning and engineering achievements visible at sites throughout the Americas demonstrate technological capabilities that surpass many contemporary projects. The governmental institutions developed by indigenous peoples balanced individual freedom with collective decision-making in ways that could inform contemporary political reform. The conflict resolution techniques and social support systems maintained by many Native American societies addressed problems that continue to challenge modern communities. But accessing this knowledge requires acknowledging its systematic suppression and working actively to reconstruct understanding that was deliberately destroyed. The process involves supporting indigenous communities in preserving and sharing traditional knowledge while respecting their authority over cultural information. It requires funding archaeological research that isn't constrained by political pressures to maintain established narratives. It demands educational reform that presents ancient American history with the depth and respect accorded to other world civilizations. It necessitates media representation that acknowledges indigenous sophistication without romanticizing or oversimplifying complex historical realities. The dark secrets of ancient America aren't just about what happened thousands of years ago, but about how that history continues to be suppressed and distorted today. Understanding the true scope of pre-Columbian achievements requires confronting the ongoing legacy of colonial narratives that shaped American consciousness for centuries. The archaeological evidence reveals civilizations that created remarkable innovations while engaging in systematic violence, that developed sustainable practices while sometimes exhausting local resources, that achieved impressive social cooperation while maintaining oppressive hierarchies. Ancient Americans were fully human, with all the complexity that humanity entails. Learning from their successes and failures requires honest acknowledgement of both achievements and shortcomings, while recognizing the systematic suppression of evidence that challenged colonial justifications for conquest and dispossession. The process isn't comfortable, but it's essential for understanding both American history and contemporary challenges. The evidence continues to accumulate despite institutional resistance. Each new archaeological discovery reveals additional aspects of ancient American sophistication. Each analysis of museum collections uncovers previously unrecognized innovations and achievements. Each genetic study demonstrates cultural and biological complexity that challenges oversimplified historical narratives. But translating this evidence into public understanding requires confronting powerful interests that benefit from maintaining established narratives. Educational institutions, media corporations, and political organizations all have investments in particular versions of American history that serve contemporary purposes. Changing these institutional frameworks requires sustained effort by researchers, educators, and citizens who recognize the importance of historical accuracy for addressing contemporary challenges. The knowledge systems developed by ancient Americans over thousands of years contain insights that could provide crucial guidance for environmental management, social organization, and technological innovation. But time is running out to preserve and learn from surviving fragments of traditional knowledge. Languages that encode sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships are disappearing. Elders who maintain connections to pre-colonial knowledge systems are passing away without full transmission to younger generations. Cultural practices that sustained knowledge preservation across centuries are being disrupted by ongoing assimilation pressures. The loss represents not just tragedy for indigenous communities, but intellectual catastrophe for all of humanity. The accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of sustainable living in diverse American environments could provide essential guidance for addressing climate change, resource depletion, and environmental degradation. The governmental innovations that allowed diverse populations to maintain unity while preserving local autonomy could offer alternatives to political systems that seem increasingly unable to address complex challenges requiring long-term cooperation. The conflict resolution techniques that emphasized restoration rather than punishment could transform approaches to criminal justice and social healing. But accessing this knowledge requires acknowledging the systematic nature of its suppression and working actively to support indigenous communities in preserving and sharing traditional wisdom. The process involves more than just academic research or museum exhibitions. It requires fundamental changes in how American society understands its own history and identity. The dark secrets of ancient America reveal both remarkable human achievements and systematic efforts to suppress knowledge of those achievements. Understanding this history accurately requires confronting uncomfortable truths about colonial destruction and ongoing marginalization of indigenous peoples. But it also reveals possibilities for learning from sophisticated knowledge systems that could address contemporary global challenges. The archaeological record continues to grow despite institutional pressures to maintain simplified narratives. The evidence demonstrates that ancient Americans created some of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history while developing innovations that remain relevant for contemporary society. Their achievements and failures offer crucial lessons for addressing current challenges, but only if we're willing to acknowledge the full complexity of their societies and the systematic suppression of evidence about their accomplishments. The story that emerges from honest examination of the archaeological evidence isn't simple or comfortable, but it's far more interesting and ultimately more instructive than sanitized narratives that have dominated popular understanding. Ancient America was home to fully human societies capable of remarkable creativity and systematic brutality, innovative problem-solving, and devastating environmental destruction, sophisticated cooperation, and oppressive hierarchy. Understanding this complexity requires moving beyond both romanticized and demonized portrayals to acknowledge ancient Americans as complex human beings who face challenges similar to those confronting contemporary society. Their successes and failures provide guidance for contemporary decision-making, but only if we're willing to learn from both their achievements and their mistakes, while acknowledging the ongoing suppression of knowledge that could prove essential for addressing current global challenges. The true scope of this historical suppression becomes clear when we examine how archaeological evidence has been systematically reinterpreted to serve political narratives. Take the Newark earthworks in Ohio, a complex of geometric earthen enclosures covering over 4 square miles. When European settlers first encountered these monuments in the early 1800s, they were so impressed by their mathematical precision that they refused to believe Native Americans could have built them. The Great Circle at Newark is a perfect circle 1,200 feet in diameter, constructed with an accuracy that rivals modern surveying techniques. The octagon earthwork covers 50 acres and aligns precisely with the 18.5-year lunar cycle, demonstrating astronomical knowledge that required generations of careful observation. Together, these structures represent one of the most sophisticated examples of geometric earthwork construction anywhere in the world. Yet 19th century archaeologists consistently attributed the Newark earthworks to a lost race of white people who had supposedly vanished before Native Americans arrived. This mound builder myth persisted for over a century despite overwhelming evidence that the earthworks were built by the ancestors of contemporary indigenous tribes. The myth wasn't based on scientific evidence, but on racial assumptions about what Native Americans were capable of achieving. The persistence of these false narratives reveals how deeply colonial biases shaped archaeological interpretation. When evidence contradicted assumptions about indigenous capabilities, the evidence was reinterpreted rather than the assumptions challenged. This pattern repeated across thousands of archaeological sites throughout the Americas, systematically minimizing indigenous achievements while maintaining European claims to cultural superiority. Even today, the language used to describe ancient American sites reflects these colonial biases. European Bronze Age settlements with evidence of craft specialization and social hierarchy are called civilizations. American sites with equivalent or superior evidence are labeled complex chiefdoms or advanced hunter-gatherers. The terminology maintains hierarchical assumptions about cultural development that serve contemporary political purposes. This linguistic manipulation becomes particularly evident when examining how similar archaeological evidence gets interpreted differently depending on its geographic location. Stone circles in Britain are celebrated as sophisticated astronomical observatories demonstrating advanced mathematical knowledge. Medicine wheels in North America with identical or superior astronomical alignments are described as simple ceremonial sites with unclear purposes. The double standard extends to technological achievements as well. European megalithic construction is praised for its engineering sophistication and organizational requirements. American earthwork construction involving millions of cubic yards of precisely placed soil is described as the work of simple farmers with seasonal labor surplus. The bias is subtle but consistent, systematically diminishing American achievements while highlighting European accomplishments. Recent developments in archaeological science have made this systematic bias increasingly difficult to maintain. LiDAR technology has revealed the true scale of ancient American urban development, particularly in tropical regions where dense vegetation had concealed massive settlements. Ground-penetrating radar has identified complex subsurface features that demonstrate sophisticated planning and engineering at sites previously thought to be simple villages. In the Amazon basin, aerial surveys have documented over 800 previously unknown earthwork sites, covering an area larger than Britain. These aren't crude clearings, but sophisticated geometric complexes with precise astronomical alignments and evidence of urban-scale planning. The earthworks required moving millions of tons of soil according to mathematical principles that demonstrate advanced engineering knowledge. The sites were connected by raised roadways that stretched for hundreds of miles through dense rainforest. These causeways were elevated above seasonal flooding and maintained stable surfaces for year-round transportation. The engineering required to build and maintain this road network through challenging tropical terrain surpassed anything Europeans achieved in similar environments until the modern era. Carbon dating reveals that this Amazonian urban civilization flourished for over 1,000 years before collapsing around 1500 CE, just as European diseases began spreading through indigenous populations. At its peak, the region supported populations that may have reached into the millions, making it one of the most densely populated areas on Earth at the time. Yet this evidence of massive ancient urbanization in the Amazon directly contradicts colonial narratives about the region as an untouched wilderness inhabited only by small bands of primitive hunter-gatherers. Acknowledging the true scale of pre-Columbian Amazonian civilization would require admitting that European colonization destroyed sophisticated urban societies rather than bringing development to empty forests. The systematic suppression of this evidence serves contemporary economic interests, just as it served colonial political purposes. If the Amazon was densely populated by sophisticated urban societies for over a millennium, then current industrial development projects cannot be justified as bringing civilization to unused wilderness. Indigenous land rights claims gain credibility when supported by evidence of ancient urban occupation and sophisticated resource management. Similar patterns of suppression characterize the treatment of archaeological evidence throughout the Americas. In the Pacific Northwest, fish trap complexes that operated continuously for thousands of years demonstrate sophisticated understanding of salmon ecology and sustainable harvesting techniques. These installations required coordinated labor involving hundreds of people and represented technological achievements that surpassed anything Europeans built in similar environments. The fish traps were precisely engineered to maximize catches during spawning runs, while allowing enough fish to reach upstream breeding grounds to maintain population stability. The technology was so effective that salmon runs remained robust for thousands of years under indigenous management, only collapsing after European colonization introduced industrial fishing methods and habitat destruction. Yet this evidence of sophisticated resource management is consistently ignored in discussions about sustainable development and environmental protection. The techniques that maintained salmon populations for millennia are dismissed as primitive fishing methods rather than advanced conservation technology that could inform contemporary fisheries management. The suppression extends to evidence of ancient American achievements in metallurgy and materials science. In the Great Lakes region, indigenous peoples developed copper-working techniques that produced tools and ornaments of remarkable sophistication. They discovered how to anneal copper to increase its workability and created alloys that enhanced strength and durability. Some artifacts demonstrate cold-working techniques that weren't mastered in Europe until much later periods. The scale of ancient American copper production was enormous. Archaeological surveys have identified over 5,000 ancient mining sites throughout the Great Lakes region, with some individual mines removing hundreds of tons of ore. The total copper extracted over thousands of years may have exceeded £1 billion. representing one of the largest pre-industrial mining operations in human history. This copper was distributed throughout North America via trade networks that stretched from the Arctic Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico. Copper artifacts found in archaeological sites thousands of miles from the Great Lakes demonstrate commercial relationships that operated for centuries with remarkable consistency and quality control. Yet this evidence of sophisticated mining, metallurgy, and continental trade networks receives minimal attention in popular accounts of ancient American technology. The achievements are consistently downplayed or attributed to simple gathering of surface copper rather than systematic mining and advanced metalworking techniques. The pattern of suppression becomes even more apparent when examining evidence for ancient American achievements in mathematics and astronomy. At Chaco Canyon, the buildings demonstrate understanding of complex geometric relationships and precise astronomical alignments that required sophisticated mathematical knowledge. Casa Rinconada, the Great Kiva at Chaco, contains 28 niches around its circumference that correspond to the lunar month. The building's orientation aligns with the lunar standstill cycle, allowing priests to predict eclipses and track long-term celestial patterns. The mathematical calculations required for these observations involved concepts that weren't developed in European astronomy until centuries later. The Chacoan road system demonstrates equally sophisticated understanding of surveying and engineering principles. The roads run in perfectly straight lines across hundreds of miles of desert terrain, maintaining consistent widths and grades despite challenging topography. Some segments required cutting through solid rock or building stone ramps up cliff faces, representing engineering challenges that would test modern construction crews. Yet these achievements in mathematics, astronomy, and engineering are consistently minimized in popular accounts of ancient American technology. The roads are described as ceremonial pathways rather than sophisticated transportation infrastructure. The astronomical alignments are dismissed as coincidental rather than evidence of advanced scientific knowledge. This systematic minimization serves to maintain colonial narratives about European technological superiority, even when archaeological evidence clearly demonstrates the opposite. Ancient American innovations in engineering, astronomy, and urban planning often surpassed contemporary European achievements. But acknowledging this would require fundamental revision of historical narratives that continue to serve contemporary political purposes. The suppression becomes particularly problematic when examining evidence for ancient American innovations that could address contemporary global challenges. Traditional agricultural techniques developed in the Americas increased crop yields while improving soil fertility over time, achieving sustainability that modern industrial agriculture has failed to match. The raised field systems developed in the Andes and Amazon could produce higher crop yields per acre than contemporary mechanized farming, while actually enhancing ecosystem health. These techniques involved sophisticated understanding of hydrology, soil chemistry, and plant genetics that took thousands of years to develop and refine. The Three Sisters planting method developed by indigenous peoples in eastern North America demonstrates similar sophistication in agricultural science. Corn, beans, and squash grown together create symbiotic relationships that increase total yields while improving soil nutrition. The technique is so effective that it's still used by organic farmers today, yet its indigenous origins are rarely acknowledged in agricultural education. Traditional water management systems developed throughout the Americas achieved levels of efficiency and sustainability that contemporary engineering struggles to match. The qanats of ancient Peru moved water across hundreds of miles of desert terrain using gravity-fed underground channels that operated for centuries without maintenance. The technology was so sophisticated that many of these systems are still functioning today. In the southwestern United States, indigenous peoples developed check dam systems that controlled erosion and retained moisture in ways that allowed agriculture in regions that are now considered too arid for farming. Archaeological evidence shows these systems supported substantial populations for over 1,000 years before being abandoned during the colonial period. Yet these innovations in sustainable agriculture and water management are consistently overlooked in discussions about addressing contemporary environmental challenges. The techniques that sustained large populations for millennia, while maintaining ecosystem health, are dismissed as primitive subsistence strategies rather than advanced environmental technologies that could inform contemporary development projects. The systematic suppression of indigenous technological achievements serves contemporary economic interests that profit from maintaining unsustainable industrial practices. If traditional indigenous techniques are more effective and sustainable than modern industrial methods, then current approaches to agriculture, resource extraction, and environmental management lose their justification. The pattern extends to suppression of evidence about indigenous social innovations that addressed problems contemporary society struggles to resolve. Many ancient American societies developed governmental systems that balanced individual rights with collective decision-making in ways that prevented the polarization and dysfunction that characterizes contemporary democratic institutions. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy operated under a constitution that guaranteed representation for all community members, while maintaining unity among diverse populations across vast territories. Women held positions of authority that had no equivalents in European political systems. Decisions affecting future generations were evaluated according to their impact 7 generations into the future, ensuring long-term thinking in policy making. These political innovations directly influenced the development of American democracy, with Benjamin Franklin and other founders studying and borrowing from indigenous governmental systems. The federal structure of the United States, with power shared between local and national authorities, was based partly on Haudenosaunee models that had operated successfully for centuries. Yet this indigenous contribution to American political development has been systematically erased from historical narratives. Textbooks credit European Enlightenment philosophers with inventing democratic principles while ignoring the living examples of democratic governance that existed throughout the Americas when Europeans first arrived. The erasure serves contemporary political purposes just as it served colonial ones. If indigenous peoples developed sophisticated political systems that influenced American democracy, then their descendants' claims to sovereignty and self-determination gain credibility. If traditional governmental structures were effective and democratic, then contemporary marginalization of Native American political rights becomes harder to justify. But archaeological evidence continues to accumulate that challenges these suppression efforts and reveals the true sophistication of ancient American societies. Recent excavations at Spiro Mounds in Oklahoma have uncovered evidence of artistic achievements that rival anything produced in medieval Europe. Shell engravings demonstrate mastery of proportion, perspective, and symbolic representation that required specialized training and sophisticated aesthetic theories. The artifacts from Spiro show clear evidence of contact with cultures throughout North and Central America. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast were carved with images that incorporate iconographic elements from as far away as Mexico and the Great Lakes region. The artistic synthesis demonstrates cultural exchange networks that operated on continental scales with remarkable consistency over centuries. Isotope analysis of artifacts and human remains from Spiro reveals trade relationships that brought exotic materials from thousands of miles away. Copper from Michigan, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, and marine shells from both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts all appear in Spiro burials, demonstrating commercial networks that spanned the entire continent. The scale and sophistication of these trade networks challenges fundamental assumptions about ancient American social organization. The coordination required to maintain continental commerce over centuries implies governmental institutions, standardized currencies, and quality control systems that rival those of any ancient civilization anywhere in the world. Yet evidence for these sophisticated commercial and political institutions is consistently ignored or minimized in popular accounts of ancient American history. The trade networks are described as occasional exchanges between neighboring tribes rather than systematic continental commerce. The governmental institutions that coordinated these activities are dismissed as simple chiefdoms rather than complex state-level organizations. This systematic minimization serves to maintain colonial narratives about indigenous political incapacity that continue to justify contemporary marginalization of Native American sovereignty claims. If ancient indigenous societies operated complex governmental institutions that coordinated activities across continental scales, then their descendants' claims to sophisticated political traditions gain credibility. The pattern of suppression extends to evidence about ancient American achievements in urban planning and architecture that surpass contemporary European cities. At Teotihuacan in Mexico, archaeological surveys have revealed urban planning principles that weren't adopted in European cities until the modern era. The city was laid out according to a precise grid system oriented to astronomical alignments. Wide avenues divided residential districts, each containing apartment complexes that housed multiple families with access to running water and sophisticated drainage systems. The urban infrastructure supported populations that may have reached 200,000 people, making Teotihuacan one of the largest cities in the world during its peak period. The apartment complexes at Teotihuacan demonstrate understanding of urban planning principles that address problems of density, sanitation, and social organization that challenged European cities for centuries. Each complex contained courtyards that provided light and ventilation, sophisticated drainage systems that prevented disease transmission, and standardized construction that allowed efficient resource utilization. The city's water management system was particularly sophisticated, incorporating underground aqueducts, storage reservoirs, and distribution networks that supplied clean water to every residential district. The technology was so advanced that it continued operating for centuries after the city's political collapse, supporting smaller populations until the Spanish conquest. Yet these achievements in urban planning and engineering are consistently downplayed in popular accounts of ancient American civilization. Teotihuacan is described as a ceremonial center rather than a major city. The sophisticated infrastructure is attributed to favorable environmental conditions rather than advanced engineering knowledge. The systematic minimization serves to maintain narratives about European urban innovations that ignore the fact that indigenous American cities often surpassed contemporary European settlements in size, sophistication, and livability. Acknowledging the true scale of ancient American urbanization would require admitting that European colonization destroyed cities that were more advanced than anything Europeans had built. Recent developments in DNA analysis have begun to reveal the true scope of ancient American population movements and cultural exchanges that challenge simplified narratives about isolated tribal societies. Genetic studies show complex patterns of migration, intermarriage, and cultural mixing that characterize the pre-Columbian period throughout the Americas. These findings demonstrate that ancient American societies were characterized by the same kinds of population movements, cultural exchanges, and territorial changes that shaped Old World civilizations. The genetic data reveals sophisticated networks of cultural and biological exchange that operated across vast distances for thousands of years. But presenting this evidence requires careful navigation of contemporary political sensitivities. Genetic studies that demonstrate ancient population movements could be misused to question contemporary indigenous land claims. Research revealing ancient cultural mixing might be cited to challenge tribal identity claims or sovereignty arguments. The challenge for researchers is how to present accurate scientific information while avoiding contributing to contemporary injustices against indigenous peoples. Ancient American history was complex and dynamic, but acknowledging this complexity shouldn't be used to undermine contemporary Native American rights or cultural claims. The solution requires sophisticated understanding of how scientific evidence functions in political contexts. Genetic studies that reveal ancient population movements don't invalidate contemporary indigenous territorial claims any more than similar evidence in Europe invalidates contemporary national boundaries. Historical complexity should inform rather than determine contemporary political relationships, but achieving this sophisticated understanding requires educational systems that present ancient American history with the same depth and nuance accorded to other world civilizations. Students need to learn about the achievements and complexities of pre-Columbian societies, while understanding how colonial narratives shaped subsequent historical interpretation. The archaeological evidence continues to accumulate despite institutional pressures to maintain simplified narratives. Each new discovery reveals additional aspects of ancient American sophistication that challenge colonial assumptions about indigenous capabilities. The evidence demonstrates technological innovations, social institutions, and cultural achievements that rival anything found in ancient civilizations anywhere in the world. Understanding this evidence accurately requires acknowledging both the remarkable achievements of ancient American civilizations and the systematic suppression of evidence that challenged colonial narratives. The process involves confronting uncomfortable truths about historical distortion while recognizing the ongoing relevance of indigenous knowledge systems for addressing contemporary global challenges. The dark secrets of ancient America aren't just about what happened thousands of years ago, but about how that history continues to be suppressed and distorted today. The archaeological record reveals civilizations that achieved remarkable innovations while engaging in complex social relationships that included both cooperation and conflict, sustainability and environmental destruction, democratic institutions and oppressive hierarchies. Learning from this history requires honest acknowledgement of both achievements and failures, while recognizing how colonial narratives systematically minimized indigenous accomplishments. The evidence demonstrates that ancient Americans created some of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history, while developing innovations that remain relevant for contemporary society. But accessing this knowledge requires confronting the ongoing legacy of suppression that continues to shape American historical consciousness. The systematic minimization of indigenous achievements serves contemporary political and economic interests, just as it served colonial purposes. Changing these patterns requires sustained effort to support accurate historical education and recognition of indigenous intellectual contributions. The process isn't comfortable, but it's essential for understanding both American history and contemporary challenges. The knowledge systems developed by ancient Americans over thousands of years contain insights that could provide crucial guidance for addressing climate change, social inequality, and political dysfunction that threaten contemporary society. But time is running out to preserve and learn from surviving fragments of traditional knowledge. The accumulated wisdom of millennia of sustainable living could be lost forever if current trends toward cultural assimilation and language death continue. Understanding the true scope of ancient American achievements is the first step toward recognizing the ongoing value of indigenous knowledge systems for addressing the challenges that face all of humanity. The evidence we've examined tonight represents only a fraction of what archaeologists continue to discover about the sophisticated civilizations that flourished throughout the Americas for thousands of years before European contact. Each new excavation reveals additional evidence of technological innovations, social institutions, and cultural achievements that challenge everything we thought we knew about ancient American history. Yet despite this mounting evidence, the systematic suppression of indigenous accomplishments continues through educational policies, media representations, and institutional practices that maintain colonial narratives about European cultural superiority. The consequences extend far beyond academic archaeology to affect contemporary political relationships, environmental policies, and social justice issues that impact millions of people. Understanding the true complexity of ancient American history requires acknowledging both the remarkable achievements and the systematic violence that characterize these societies, while recognizing how evidence of indigenous sophistication has been systematically suppressed to serve colonial and contemporary political purposes. The process involves confronting uncomfortable truths about historical distortion, while working to preserve and learn from knowledge systems that could provide essential guidance for addressing current global challenges. The archaeological record continues to grow despite ongoing suppression efforts, revealing civilizations that created innovations in sustainable agriculture, democratic governance, environmental management, and urban planning that surpass many contemporary achievements. Their successes and failures offer crucial lessons for addressing current challenges, but only if we're willing to move beyond colonial narratives that have shaped American consciousness for centuries. The dark secrets of ancient America are finally coming to light, revealing both the remarkable complexity of pre-Columbian civilizations and the systematic efforts to suppress knowledge of their achievements. Understanding this history accurately is essential not just for correcting historical distortions, but for accessing wisdom that could prove crucial for humanity's survival in an era of unprecedented global challenges. But the window for preserving and learning from this ancient knowledge is rapidly closing as languages disappear, elders pass away, and traditional practices are lost to ongoing assimilation pressures. The responsibility falls on all of us to support efforts to preserve indigenous knowledge while working to ensure that the true history of ancient America is finally given the recognition and respect it deserves. The evidence speaks for itself, but only if we're willing to listen. The sophisticated civilizations that once flourished throughout the Americas created innovations that could help address the environmental and social challenges that threaten our contemporary world. Their achievements and failures offer guidance for building more sustainable and equitable societies, but only if we abandon colonial narratives that have systematically obscured their true accomplishments for far too long. Too long. The story we've uncovered tonight isn't just ancient history gathering dust in academic journals. It's a living reminder that the ground beneath our feet holds secrets that could reshape how we understand human achievement, environmental stewardship, and social organization. The sophisticated civilizations that flourished throughout the Americas for thousands of years before European contact didn't simply vanish into archaeological obscurity. Their innovations in sustainable agriculture, democratic governance, urban planning, and astronomical observation represent accumulated wisdom that remains startlingly relevant for addressing the climate change, political polarization, and environmental destruction that threaten our contemporary world. Yet the systematic suppression of these achievements continues today through educational curricula that reduce indigenous peoples to footnotes, media representations that perpetuate colonial stereotypes, and institutional practices that prioritize maintaining comfortable narratives over confronting historical truth. Each time we describe Cahokia as a ceremonial center, rather than acknowledging it as the sophisticated metropolis it was, each time we dismiss ancient American astronomical observations as primitive skywatching, rather than recognizing them as advanced scientific achievements, we participate in the ongoing erasure of knowledge that could prove essential for humanity's future. The archaeological evidence continues to accumulate despite these suppression efforts, revealing civilizations that achieved technological and social innovations surpassing many contemporary accomplishments. But the window for learning from surviving fragments of traditional indigenous knowledge is rapidly closing as languages disappear and elders pass away without full transmission to younger generations. The responsibility falls on all of us to support accurate historical education, to demand that museums and textbooks present ancient American history with the depth and respect it deserves, and to recognize that understanding our continent's true past isn't just about correcting historical injustices, but about accessing wisdom that could help us build a more sustainable and equitable future for all. The dark secrets of ancient America have finally been brought into the light, revealing both the remarkable achievements and complex realities of civilizations that shape this continent long before European arrival. Their story is our story, and learning from both their triumphs and their failures may be the key to writing a better chapter for the generations yet to come.